we will make a start with the informal part of the meeting. I think we're all familiar with the fact that this is not the board proper, but we do use it as an opportunity to feed back semi-formally really on what we've seen in the various areas that we've visited. There ended up being a few overlaps today, I think we're just going to have to kind of ad-lib a bit. I'm not entirely sure that I know exactly where everybody went. But according to my list, Ruth and Anne went to Gloucester and CCU. Is that correct? Excellent. Right. Who's going to feed back?
Do you want me to start and then Ruth can add? So we did indeed go to Gloucester and the cardiac care unit. So Gloucester is a respiratory ward. About I think 30 beds, something like that. So it's quite big. Covers sort of the full range of people from 18 to I think they had somebody who was 102. So it's quite a big age range. And we were shown round by Naomi. So it was impressive. There looked to be really good relationships. If you watch the interactions between staff on the wards, it was all very positive. And actually, despite the space constraints, we witnessed them trying to manoeuvre a bed round the very pokey corridors, which I have to say you probably need to have an advanced driving course to manage it successfully. It was well ordered, I think. So the kind of I guess the two big takeaways, or maybe three big takeaways for me. One was that actually space. So it wasn't the clinical space, and actually what's happened over the years is that what were clinical rooms have been, or what were staff difficult conversation rooms have actually all been taken. And we looked at the cupboard that was was Naomi's office, and it was literally a cupboard. I think my cupboard under the stairs is as big as her office. We looked at the staff room, which they're very proud of, and actually was quite nice, but doesn't have a window. And if you want staff to relax, that's not really very good. And that a small number of side rooms to deal with patients who were infectious or end of life care. So that was a kind of, I think, a really big point there, and actually it came up in the CCU as well. It's an interesting tension between the ward itself managing its beds and the bed management unit for the hospital, and actually Naomi was very understanding about that tension. But if you've got people in a side room on palliative care, you really don't want to move them out because you've got somebody in ED who's infectious. And I think they try very hard to manage that, but there is clearly a tension there. And ironically, it was the same issue I picked up at George's yesterday on the oncology ward, and particularly at night where you're desperately trying to get beds for people, and you've got more junior staff on the ward, and whether or not we've kind of got the balance there right. But as I say, very well run. And then we went to the cardiac care unit where we met James and Derek. But I think we'd sort of pretty much kind of had that conversation. Again, felt well run, good relationships, really experienced. It was Mary who talked to us, really experienced. It felt well ordered, but again, really tight. Didn't have the rooms it needed for the other conversations. How do you have a private conversation with a member of staff, if you haven't got a room to do it? The one takeaway that I thought was, I said, what's the one message you might want to give to the board? And actually the suggestion was, if you want staff to feel valued, is there a way of creating or recreating perhaps the staff-only areas in canteens, and maybe more of a kind of fast-track queue that allows people to have proper breaks away from the ward? Because actually, it was pretty intense. It's all very all hands to the pump while they're there. The only other point I would say is that we did have a conversation about single occupancy rooms and the move to the standard being 100% single rooms, which actually wasn't felt to be a good model from a nursing perspective, because if you've got really acute patients, they almost counterintuitively, they put the patients who were more well in the single rooms, because they had to cohort the really ill patients so you could manage it. And I thought that was quite an interesting point, really, given the government's stance. But very good. It was nice to see somewhere different at Epsom, and I came away, as always, feeling uplifted and ready for the board. So was there anything I've missed?
No, thank you. The only other thing I was going to add on Gloucester, which is respiratory ward, we saw the MDT in action. So they've got a shared working space, which I think helps MDT working. And we also heard how Gloucester are trying to innovate, given they've got OT shortages, and that some of the roles that OTs have historically undertaken, the nursing staff are now undertaking assessments for. And whilst they can see the benefits of that, it presents its own challenges in terms of nursing workload. So the one thing I've taken away is their wish to ensure that in looking at nurse staff and ratios, we actually are cognizant of what the therapy provision on the wards is, because they feel that has impacted on their workload recently.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed, Anne and Ruth. Okay, so we got to a good start with the list being absolutely right. So I'm going to see if James and Derek, according to my list, went to HDU and Swift.
We did.
You did?
We did.
Excellent. And are you going to feed back, Derek?
We didn't agree this, but I presume so. James, you can.
You start and I'll chip in at the end.
Yeah, so we went to Swift Ward first, which is a surgical ward. Oh, sorry, thank you very much. Thank you for the reminder, sorry about that. Went to Swift Ward first, which is a surgical ward. The initial impression is it's a clean space, the resus trolley was easily visible, the fire exits were clear, and it was, as far as I could see, it was clean and tidy, looked very neat. We spoke to Juliet, the nurse in charge, and talked to her about some of the issues on the ward. I think staffing came up fairly early. They run with a lot of agency staff. They're running at quite a high vacancy rate. I can't remember the numbers exactly. They're interviewing for 2 posts today, I think 2 band 5s. So hopefully that'll go some way towards addressing that. And in fact, that was apparent, because as I looked round, there were about 6 different uniforms, and I wasn't quite sure who was who. And I think if I was a patient, I'd find that quite confusing, knowing who was who, because of the diversity of uniforms. Some were agency uniforms, I think some were student uniforms, and so on. We talked about fundamentals of care, because it's something we always talk about at board, and asked about how they addressed that. And the response was that was mainly addressed in the huddle, that they had a huddle at the beginning and end of the day, and reviewed nutritional state, falls risk, and so on during that period. And that it was addressed at the bedside as well in the documentation. So hard to say how good a grip they had on that, but I got the impression that the nurse in charge had a fairly good grip on fundamental care. We spoke to one patient who'd recently had major surgery. He said he'd had a 9.5-hour operation, which sounds pretty major to me. He was on his 2nd day post-op. He described the care as being excellent. He was now mobilising, and was very positive about all the care he had. We asked him, is there one thing you would change? And he said the anaesthetic room felt like a broom cupboard, and there wasn't really enough room for all the people that were trying to put him to sleep to get in. And in fact, I think they had to put him in another room to anaesthetise him, so I don't know quite whether he was in the pre-op room or something, I don't know. But that was the thing he flagged up as something he'd noticed. And we went from there to HDU, and the reason we ended up being on your ward was we were trying to find a way out, because I mean, estates is going to come up again and again. Estates came up. It did feel very fragmented. We basically visited 3 different geographical areas. There's an HDU on Swift that's ready to reopen, and there's 2 bits of HDU downstairs, and to get from one to the other you have to go through the sluice, which incidentally was very clean and tidy, and it was beautifully. I thought the sluice was, couldn't fault that. Everything was in the cupboards, everything was clean where it should be. But I think we do suffer from our estates. The air conditioning in HDU is bolted to the ceiling, basically. There's no suspended ceiling in there. There is a pod in there for isolation, which I don't think was in use today. And we spoke to Fen, one of the nurse in charge, and one of the consultants that came to join us. Sorry. Yes. And they both, you got the feeling they were working well together as a team, that there was a good atmosphere. There seemed to be quite a lot of staff there, but when we asked what are the issues that you face, it was staffing again, particularly on the nursing staffing. We talked quite a lot about the outreach team that seems to be working well and trying to emphasise the teaching role of the outreach team rather than just taking over, which was a very positive thing, I think. And finally, just to mention, we bumped into and had a very interesting corridor conversation with one of the geriatricians, who's
Marlin Farnsworth, yeah.
Marlon. Marlin, who gave us a very impressive, well, I was very impressed by her comments about the frailty service they're running and the future of that, and the fact that they're attracting very good junior staff who want to carry on working with the service, and that to me is always a very good sign. So lots of positives. It's clean and tidy. Staffing kept coming up as an issue, and estates, obviously, recurrent issue. Do my summary, but uplifted like Anne.
Excellent. Thank you very
James,
much,
do you want
Gary.
to?
Anything to
I
add,
didn't
James?
say too much.
Just the other thing we noted with Swift was the intensity of the patient turnover. So they've got both elective and multiple day case turnovers, and sometimes they're flipping beds from elective to day case during the course of a day, and it felt quite intensive for the nursing staff, really. So, but, you know, in terms of the numbers on the board that they were getting through, clearly quite a feat of nursing care to do it.
Yeah, so I didn't. So can I just come back on that? I was struck by that, and they seem to almost be double bedding. You've got a long stay patient in a bed, but you sit them out and put a day case in their bed during the day, and then when the day case goes home at night, the long stay patient goes back in. It's almost a double bedding, which
Jacqueline's looking horrified.
Yeah.
Yeah.
they seem to make it work. She didn't seem quite confident about it, but
I was a little unsure, so I didn't want to get into too much discussion.
no, but that was a bit concerning. Yes, how tight they were for the day cases.
Okay, perhaps that one's to discuss outside the meeting.
I'll aim mine at this one.
Yeah, can I leave that with you, James, for you just to, and I'll leave to satisfy yourselves on that. I was just conscious that I've still got quite a list to get through, so. Sorry, the next on my list is Stephen Jones and myself, and we were meant to go to Buckley and Swift, but we very quickly realised that you'd been to Swift and they'd kind of in the nicest possible way had enough because they were really run off their feet. But Stephen's going to feedback.
Yeah, so we got the benefit as a result of that of spending more time in Buckley, which is very interesting actually. So we were met by the matron there called Amberley, who'd been in post since September last year, and she gave us a bit of background to the ward and some of the challenges that it faces. So a 37-bedded ward. She said it was the largest ward in the trust that officially dealt with acute gastro and elderly care patients, but that in practice it actually dealt with a much broader mix of patients, medical, bariatric, mental health, etc. So she emphasised the complex nature of the cases. There was a big focus on space and about the layout of the ward. So in terms of the size of the ward, she talked about how that presented some challenges to the staff there, and that some of the space challenges were very similar to the points that Anne was raising earlier. So lots of clinical areas, but actually very little space to hold MDTs. Showed us the MDT meeting room, which was very, very small, with very little furniture in there for people to sit. It was very, very cramped. They were having their morning huddle in there as we were there, and so that sort of brought to light. So they've clearly got some ideas about how they would like to use the space in some different ways. The matron also talked to us about how the ward, she felt, had improved in recent months. So she talked to us about how they'd made good progress. They felt that they were bronze accredited at the moment. They felt that it was credible to get to silver at the next accreditation. They'd made good progress in having no SIs, no hospital-acquired pressure ulcers. and that they'd also caught up on some of the backlog of SI investigation reports that had been outstanding. I think they said 7 out of 8 outstanding reports had now been dealt with. So pleased about the progress there. Highlighted some challenges around staffing. So a couple of posts that they'd been struggling to recruit to, but felt there was progress being made there. And then a bit like Anne, we said, well, which issues would you like to flag to the ward? So space was the predominant one that came through. There were some other estates ones, so it was highlighted that it was very hot in the ward, that a vent had been broken and hadn't been fixed, so we asked how long. We were told it had been broken for about 2 years. So that was one thing to flag. And then the other, as we were leaving, the other thing that she flagged to us was the extent to which the ward was dealing with quite a high level of palliative care patients, particularly from the community, and how that created not an ideal case for the patients themselves or their families, but also created some challenges for staff. So that was the other point highlighted.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. I thought that last point was maybe worth mentioning, James, because I got the sense, and this is she didn't actually use this language, but we're kind of being used as a bit of a hospice from homes. I don't mean private homes, I mean residential and nursing homes. So these were people who were absolutely at end of life, and I just wondered if we could find a better solution. Ruth, you wanted to come in.
It was just to say that we had our ESTH End of Life Care Steering Group last week where this issue was raised. Actually, we had good representation from external providers at the group, so that the teams already are working together to make sure that where appropriate we can actually expedite discharges, because I think that what has happened is some of the paperwork and the referral processes are taking so long that they're not actually allowing patients to get there in good time. So it's quite an active piece of work at the moment.
And to be fair, James Marsh has also been looking at how long does it take to get, from both organisations, so it's not just an issue, how long does it take to get a patient who's been identified as end of life into their preferred setting, and on average it takes 17 days, and that is just not acceptable. So there are lots of hoops that we end up having to jump through, so we do need to do something about that, because we want to get patients back to their families, or wherever they and their families decide they want to go and spend the rest of their days there as quickly as possible, because hospital isn't the right place.
Absolutely not. So that's really helpful. I'm glad to, but this point was that people were coming in from resi and nursing homes because they didn't want to cope with the very end of life. There's a
really helpful to hear that. Surrey Downs Health and Care, we've been putting in a lot of wraparound support to support care homes to take people home from acute trust in a way that they feel comfortable within the care home, working very closely with the care home sector. I think that we need to focus more on how do we keep people within the care home sector, so we can take that as part of those conversations. I think it very much lends to what support can we give into the care home that makes them feel that they're providing the safest and the best quality care for that individual, and also for their carers, because often the pressure comes from carers as well. But I will definitely take that forward.
I'm grateful, Thurza, because my own view is it wasn't best for the patients, and it was using up capacity that, as we know, is under huge pressure. So very grateful for those updates from you all in relation to that. So moving on, next on my list is Arlene and Martin, and it says Crofton, Britain, but I think given that Martin's recovering from a very nasty cold, it was probably somewhere different. But Martin, are you going to share with us where it was?
It was. We explored all sorts of lesser explored parts, including the bereavement office, phlebotomy, haemophilia, and the butterfly ward. And the first thing I wanted to say was that I was hugely impressed that everywhere we went, people knew who Arlene was. She knew who they were, or a lot of them, and they were very comfortable in talking to her about issues. And we shouldn't take that for granted, because in a lot of organisations that isn't what happens when you walk around with senior managers. Generally everything was very positive, and I thought what I'd do is to use the time just to highlight one particular issue, because I think it's quite indicative of wider things. So in haemophilia, they work 9 to 5 days a week. And when we said, is there anything you'd like to sort of raise to the board, rather reluctantly, they said there is a long-standing issue where the staff want to work 8 till 6, which would then be 4 days a week. Now, this isn't surprising because everybody's read all the stuff in the paper about 4-day weeks. There's a social change, more people want to do it, it's easy to recruit staff. But quite obviously, it does strike you it'd be better for the patients as well. Because if you can't get time off work, you know, there's a good chance you can get it at 8 o'clock and have it before you start work, or have it at 5:30. And what exactly the barrier to this was not clear as to why that change couldn't be made. But although they were okay with staffing, they did tend to lose people because there were other opportunities for them to work those kind of hours elsewhere. And I think I'll leave it at that and just hand over to Arlene, who's going to talk more about Butterfly Ward.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Yeah, it's Haematology Day Unit. Yeah. Yeah, as Martin said, so we went up to the Butterfly Clinic because when we'd gone to phlebotomy, they talked about having to do the bloods for cancer outpatients quickly. So I thought it would be good to follow the journey through. On Butterfly, we met with the consultant, who is the new Director for Education, Medical Education, Emma. Yeah. And she has since emailed me the business case that they want to get through. So we did have a good long chat about how we progress end-of-life care education in particular around the trust. I think there is, and it follows on nicely from the end-of-life care discussion on Buckley, because one of the things that the palliative care team and Emma were saying is that they need an end-of-life care discharge facilitator. So we've got the ward discharge facilitators, and we've got the palliative care team. What we need is what they feel we need, and I agree with them, is somebody that's able to focus on that. And we need to look at how we can support it with the work that we're doing around integrating, because we want to ensure that end-of-life care maintains a high profile across the group, not just for Epsom St Helier. So we've promised to look at that. And then the other thing that they want is around education. So there is, if we go back to COVID times, we changed the induction for new staff to online, and it worked well then. Since then, we've gone back to face-to-face, but palliative care seemed to have lost the slot that they had. So where they had a half a day or 3 hours at least, they now have half an hour, which is not adequate. But again, we've said that, we are looking at how we review those things as part of integration. And I do believe that the stuff that palliative care delivers is not just about how we look after end-of-life patients or palliative care patients. The communication skills and the training that they offer is quite important. So we will look at that as part of the work around integration. And as I say, I now have the business case for the education bit of it. So we will look at it. But, we do have a lot of CPD, not a lot, but we do have funding for CPD, and we should be using that. It's one of the things that we can use it towards, instead of having to find different money. So it's about using what we've got creatively, and we will look at that.
Thank you, Arlene. I think Martin wanted to
Yeah, I
come
just
back.
wanted to add, sort of from a lay perspective, what I understood on the last issue Arlene was talking about. So what they were saying was that they would like to train more doctors and nurses in there's a specific course called Advanced Communication Skills for, I'm not sure if it's end-of-life care, but it's essentially, that's what it's about, how you deal with those situations. So it sounds incredibly important. It doesn't sound like a huge amount of money, because the approach is that there are external experts who will come in and do this stuff, but it's a train-the-trainer approach. So presumably staff probably a positive for them to be qualified to then deliver that training. And normally with training like that, there's not much of a marginal cost other than clearly replacing the staff. But the other thing that stood out for me, and a little knowledge is dangerous. So, but in listening to the dialogue between the consultant and Arlene, and the consultant sort of saying, I don't know anything about money, I just know I did a business case a long time ago. And then Eileen saying, but it could come from the CPD pot. As in many big organisations, I just wondered if there was a case of perhaps people not realising that, although we are very short of money, there might be other pots of money that you can access for something else, and joining up the dots. And so just out of that, bumping into somebody on the ward, it appeared that dots were joined up, hopefully.
Well, and hopefully, Martin, the point was made that whilst we strongly support improved palliative care, we know from our structured judgment reviews, actually, that whenever we get poor marks, they're always small in number, but they're generally around palliative care. We have to be more inventive we can't simply keep adding to the pot. So, James.
I think that's a really helpful point. I mean, the context for this business planning round is that we've asked the divisions to really very strictly prioritise what they even put forward for consideration in divisional business planning meetings, because we know that if we are going to make quality investments, they have to be the very, very highest priority issues and the most urgent ones because of the overall position. What I am seeking to encourage services to do is to think more creatively about other sources of funding. So can we turn something into a bid to a national scheme? If it's an issue of staff amenity and it's a small bit of capital, can we access charity? So I think it's very helpful feedback, because actually, sort of rather than everything just being a sort of revenue pressure, we need to find different ways of accessing other forms of resource, and I think that's a large part of how we develop as an organisation some of that resilience to find other ways of getting things done. So it's really helpful feedback.
I think it's a very helpful discussion, actually. Jacqueline.
I suppose just thinking about it a bit wider is that, and what I don't think we're trying to do is just about the board deciding what we put on our CPD or training agenda.
Not at
but
all.
I think the wider bit is that there's quite a lot that goes on that Statman training bit, and we constantly fight to keep it manageable, because it's not the cost of putting the course on, it's the cost of releasing the staff that's the issue. So it is about how we balance all of that. So whilst I absolutely agree, how we communicate with patients and their relatives, regardless of where they are in their pathway, is absolutely critical. We just need to be thoughtful about how we manage all of that in the bigger context of what we need to train our staff. And that might be the one thing we're missing, and it should be there, but I just wanted to make sure we're not starting up.
And I think it's a good point, Jacqueline. I will bring you in, Arlene. I mean, my feeling is that communication skills underpin so much that it might be something that would be worth prioritising. Arlene.
And that was one of the things that I did say to them. I said, if you imagine if I go to see the diabetes team, they will say, ours is really important, we need a day on it. But we are looking at how we develop training. And the thing about it, the other thing is, if you budget as training, everybody thinks, oh my God, it's another bit of training I have to do. However, we have several fora in Epsom and St Helier where we have senior nursing teams that come together just by routine. Every Monday they meet. Can we not take one of those sessions and deliver some of it? So we started that conversation. It's not about adding money or adding time or a list, something on people's list of training they have to do. It's about using what we have and using the resource.
Thank you, everyone. I think that's been a really good discussion. We've exposed the financial pressures that we're operating under and the need for us to think creatively and differently about how we improve our offer, given that we've got much less resource to do it with. And I think that discussion about training, whilst I hope us not interfering in any way as non-executives, was both illuminating and useful. So thanks, everybody. We've just got about 30 seconds probably before we move into full board. So I'm not going to let you all have a minute, because it'll end up being 5 minutes. I'm going to start the board a few seconds early. Okay.
I wanted to make a point about the feedback of nursing, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Oh, and you haven't done yours yet?
We haven't had a chance
Oh,
yet.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh, well, we're going to start the board late. I got a bit carried away there, Phil. I allowed it to happen because I thought, we're fine on time. Over to you. You went to...
So Paul and I went to the AMU, which is the Acute Medical Unit.
Naughty, according to my list.
No, we only went to the AMU. So
that'll be Swift.
we didn't go to Swift. We didn't go to Swift either. But so the AMU, we went to 34 beds in there. Some are single, and there are some sort of cohorted as well. And what I'd like to say first is that we spoke to, I think, 4 or 5 people, and everybody said that it was a great team to work for. So it's definitely a place where people were content in their work. Even one person said they enjoyed coming to work. So it was very, from that perspective, it was very interesting. We talked about discharging to start with, because it's a short stay place basically, and like today they're going to discharge 7 patients out of the 34. They aim to do 10 every day, but and they have 2 discharge coordinators. So we met one of those, and she was working hard on ensuring, and she was talking actually at one point to the person in the discharge lounge to make sure people were moving backwards and forwards. Incredibly then, when a bed is freed up, within 20 minutes that bed can be filled up again. So the changeover time, Paul and I were both a bit staggered, and we asked a couple of times whether this was really true, because it sounded like some things go relatively slowly in the NHS, but this seemed to be going very quickly, which was very impressive. So, and all the beds were full, and they generally are all full. So it was a busy, active place. If you go to what they'd like the board to hear, it was about staffing. So it wasn't about estates for once. The estates issue was about a new desk at the front sort of door, but that was a very small issue. But the issue is staffing, and they generally are struggling to have enough people there on the ward, particularly nurses, and they generally have agency or bank there on a daily basis. And today one of the agency people hadn't turned up, so they were busy trying to get somebody else to come in, which was the issue was, I think, if people are permanent staff, the team improves even more, and it's better than having agency. So that was the issue that came up when we were talking to the nurse in charge. We interestingly talked to someone who was cleaning the floor, Florence, and she was very happy, been there a while and enjoyed it. We were talking to the guy that provides the food. He's been tupied across from Mighty and was very happy in his role in the NHS, so that was good. He only had one thing to say, is that people get paid the same on shift at the weekend as they do during the week, and that's an issue which he thinks would improve. Well, it would be easier to get people to work weekends if there was an uplift, but obviously there's a budgetary challenge with that, which needs to be balanced out with how these things work. But he was very happy in his work. So I would say, and they all said morale is good, and it's, again, we asked the actual question, how do you feel about morale? And they said, in this place it's good. And one comment was, well, actually some people have left, so there's been a bit of a changeover, I think, and they felt that as people had moved out, morale had gone up. So it was an interesting, but generally very good. And actually, estates-wise, the corridors were clear. Normally when I make these things, there's always stuff, but it was clean, tidy, and seemed to be extremely well organised. So it was uplifting, and it was a pleasure to be there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Phil. Was there anything you needed to add, Paul?
I think the only thing I would say is there was good plans to fill vacancies, which is good. And I think it's just a really good example of where when you fill your vacancies and you've got good staffing, everything starts to, that's your basic. And so I thought that was interesting. We do lots of work around engagement, but actually the fundamental is make sure that you've got enough staff in place, because if you do, people don't feel so stressed, they're working with a team, they've got time for development, all those sorts of things. So I just think that's really important.
Indeed it is. Happy teams, well led.
I'd still like to make the comment about staffing.
Yes, and Arlene wants to come in as well, so I might as well just kind of give up now. I'd rather give you the last word. So Arlene, would you like to?
No, I just wanted to say on the back of Paul's comments that because I have the history, I think the turnaround in AMU demonstrates the effect of good nursing leadership. So, AMU was one of the areas that we really, really struggled in Epsom and St Helier to get to this place where it is now. And so for me, it's all about the nursing leadership, and it's right now for AMUs, and that's what you're seeing.
Very good. Right, Jacqueline, final word.
And I'd always agree with that. I think one of the things that I would like to ask the board when they go around and staff say to them, we haven't got enough staff, is, well, if we can't have any more staff, what would you change to actually release time to care for patients? Because that is where we are going to need to go, and getting, as part of the high performing teams work we'll be starting, and actually getting to start thinking about what changes would I make, I think would be helpful. Otherwise they're left thinking, you're coming here and saying, which, you know, is that we need more staff, and we all know that we can't just do that right at the moment. So the bit, if we can't have more staff, how do we change how you work? And I think that would be, I'd ask that the board ask that question when we hear that, if you don't mind.
I think we'll be very happy to do that. Phil?
If I just quickly come back to that. So the nurse in charge we're talking to said that, of course, they can't get any more HCAs because they're only allowed, as I understand it, people who are fully employed. So the HCAs, is that right, do not come through on bank? That's what she said, wasn't it?
You're allowed to get HCAs from agents.
No, we try and avoid
so
HCAs.
So there is a bar. All I'm saying is that, and that was an accepted fact. It wasn't sort of, that's a dreadful thing. It was an accepted fact. So I think if you put bars in place, probably people will start to work around it.
Okay,
Well, it's a suggestion.
This is getting out of hand. James, and then I'm going to move into formal board.
So HCAs from agency is really poor value. I think that one of the things that we will look at as an efficiency plan going into next year is what we call our enhanced care policy, which is where sometimes we need to bring extra HCAs in to support patients with high needs. And whether as part of that we create a bit of an enhanced care pool, because actually when we look at it we might find that we're having to go out for temporary staffing quite a lot. So it is an area we're sort of actively looking at, how we make sure that we've got the right grade of support, but we bring them in the right way, because agency really isn't the answer.
Okay, so I think the discussion is helpful because it reminds us that we're moving into even more straitened financial circumstances, and we're going to have to find new ways of delivering services. So now I am going to move formally into the board, 7 minutes late, in part my own fault. So let's hope that we can keep to time. I've got a number of apologies from Aruna, Chris, James Marsh and Richard Jennings. Ruth has very kindly joined us representing Richard. I'm delighted to have Ruth with us today. Declarations of interest, anything over and above the normal declarations? No. Can we agree the minutes of the last board meeting? Thank you. And the action log and matters arising, there are only 2 there and they're both proposed for closure. Are people happy with that? Yeah. Thank you. That takes us then to item 1.5 and the Group Chief Executive's report. Jacqueline.
Well, to enable you to catch some time up, Jane, I should have. Oh, right, of course. I feel quite brief. I suppose just a couple of things. I'm sure that when we come to the performance element, that whilst things are better, I just want us to and we don't feel as much pressure, I just want us to remind us that even though that is the case, we still have patients who wait over 12 hours in ED, we still have patients that sometimes take longer to offload in ambulances, and we still have patients who are in our EDs in the morning, are waiting for a bed. And so we really need to make sure that we don't become used to that, and that we push ourselves to make those changes. And really just to advise the board that in doing that we might sometimes reduce the 4-hour standard, but I think we all know the longer you wait in A&E, the more likely you are to have a poorer outcome. So that is probably quite an important point for us to note, and I'm sure James will be more illuminating when we get to the performance report. I think hopefully most of you saw St Helier on the news a few weeks ago. Oh, thank you. Well done. Thanks to our both James and the team at St Helier, and Anna, our Director of Comms, and the team, because actually I think that was a really good piece about how our patients and staff what they're having to put up with, particularly at St Helier, although I know there are still issues on this side. And we've also had quite more conversations with the new hospital programme, of which I'm sure we'll talk about later. And lastly, all I was going to just say is about a couple of awards. Good to see that Gus Morgan, who's from our private patients team, was runner-up at the National Multicultural Apprenticeship Awards in the public sector category. They didn't make that title easy enough to say, really. And also, this was Thursday and the Surrey Downs Health and Care doing The Temi Adesina Awards were held in February, and I never met Temi, but I know she was a lead pharmacist with our at-home service, and she sadly passed away over 12 months ago. And the awards were designed to celebrate the qualities that Temi brought to the team, and it was upon those qualities of teamwork, collaboration, kindness and compassion that we base these awards. And the nominations are open to any partners across Surrey Downs Health and Care. And the awards event was well attended. We had over 90 people there. Wow, Thursday, that's a lot. Coming to celebrate the winners and remember Temi. And also Yomi, who her sister also came to the event. So I just wanted to mark those two things. Thank you, Gillian.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Jacqueline. Questions to Jacqueline? Peter?
Thank you. Thanks, Jacqueline, for the update. Lots of good stuff. Just wanted to pick up the kind of junior doctors.
Yes, I forgot to put that in, actually.
I thought you might have. I appreciate you. We might come back to it more in the private section, but nonetheless, clearly, and given, I think, yesterday's news, which suggested that there's still no apparent meeting of minds yet, but nonetheless, it is potentially serious, will have serious consequences, and which makes it all the more worrying that there isn't that dialogue happening. I just wondered if you were able to update us on what you saw as a current state of play.
So I'm going to ask Ruth to talk in a little bit more detail because she is so much closer to it than I. But it is worrying, and we are doing absolutely everything we can to keep patients safe. However, Ruth.
Thank you. So we're doing a huge amount of work in preparing for the 72 hours during which we won't have, we may not have junior doctors present. I think it's important to say we are working with our junior doctors, because it's actually really important to make sure that they are supported if they wish to take strike action. And concurrently, literally by clinical rota, we are ensuring that we are clear on what mitigations we need to put in place for the 72 hours of industrial action. So it is we're coordinating this through our emergency planning team because it needs forensic level to detail. We are making sure that where we are going to have consultants taking on roles normally taken by junior doctors, they've got the right infrastructure support, IT support, remedial training if needed to access systems they don't normally access, and we're ensuring that they feel supported and confident in undertaking the duties. So I think that it's a rapidly evolving piece, and I've got no doubt by the time the meeting finishes this morning, our position will have changed. Because we are constantly in dialogue with juniors, trying to ascertain which juniors are and aren't striking, and understanding how teams are planning to cover rotas 24/7, which we will do. And we will be working differently, we'll be embracing new ways of working, we'll be employing our physician associates, our nurse specialists. This will be a whole hospital, whole trust effort in order to safely cover patient care for the 72 hours.
I think I just wanted to add to that the likelihood, if things are going the way we think they might, the likelihood is they're able to do many, if any, electives, because we will need those staff actually filling wards and emergency care duties. So we're presuming that currently the only things we're able to do are the P1s, which is life and limb, and that will be something we'll have to stretch ourselves to do, but that is, I think, the bottom line.
Thank you for that. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth and Jacqueline, and I think that is absolutely understood. Any other queries or questions from colleagues? No? So if we could note Jacqueline's report and move on to item 2.1a, Quality Committee. Derek's kindly agreed to introduce this in Aruna's absence. Derek.
Yes, thank you. I'm bringing this report on behalf of Aruna, who's away, and bringing a report of the extract from the Joint Quality Committee of the matters that referred to ESTH. And I'll take the report as read, but I will just flag up the issues that are flagged up on the front page and talk to those orally. The key issues that have emerged from two quality committees this year are the work that's going on fundamentals of care. And as I said earlier, I was very reassured that when I asked the nurse on Swift Ward, and I said that's only a sample of one, a random sample of one, she was very familiar with the need to keep ahead of the game on fundamentals of care. So that was assuring. But at a board level, we've been assured that there's a lot of work going on around reducing the rates of pressure ulcers, falls, nutritional assessment. We're still concerned that we need a clearer idea of the level of malnutrition among the patients coming into hospital, or I should say also overnutrition, the nutritional state of patients. And trying to get must reports is something that we've been working together with the executive on. VTE is a matter of concern, and again we're working with the executive working on getting the VTE reporting levels up, and there's still work to be done on dementia screening. But the general feeling about fundamental care is that there's a lot of work going on and that we are addressing these issues. The second issue is maternity services. Again, a big focus on working with other agencies to address issues around maternity safety, and we're bidding for a fund from the maternity incentive scheme to resolve the safety actions where we haven't yet achieved compliance. And finally, infection control. There were some cases of carbapenem resistant enterococcus, that's what a CPE is, which is a potentially transmissible antibiotic resistant organism, and that outbreak seems to have resolved, and the Aspergillus cases are now we seem to have put behind us as a result of some changes in infrastructure. And I think infection control, we felt assured that there was a good grip on the issues that were going on. And the other thing we addressed that isn't on here, we talked quite a bit about vaccine. Oh, it is on here, sorry. We talked about vaccination rates and what we could do to promote vaccination. And I'm conscious that our chief executive has personally put her name and face to this programme, but felt that there was no room for complacency around trying to increase vaccination rates, particularly with flu, although thankfully we may now be coming out of the flu season. And finally, I wanted to add something that isn't on the front page here, which, because this is an ESTH extract, the other thing we talked about at the Quality Committee was the impact of the nursing strike. And although I think it's not strictly relevant to ESTH because ESTH nurses didn't achieve the threshold for strike action, I think there was a lot of learning went on at St George's about mitigating the impact of the nursing strike that we can take on board here as we move into a time when we are having our own strikes among other staff personnel. Now, clearly the nursing strike and the doctor's strike are very different animals, but the learning from mitigating the strike impact on patient safety, I think, is something that we felt was important to emphasise.
Thank you very much indeed, Derek. Is there any questions for Derek? I'm conscious that two of the items he mentioned are actually on the agenda later. No? No questions, comments? So if we could note that report. Thank you, colleagues. That takes us on to Finance Committee. Anne?
Thank you, Chair. So this is the report of the January and the February Finance Committees. I didn't actually attend the Finance Committee because I was elsewhere in the world, but I've been to a number of interim meetings, so I felt I was reasonably up to speed. In terms of the money, pretty much where we expected to be. People will note that that's a deficit, and although it's described as adverse to plan, I think conversations we've had here before, people will know that the plan to break even required a lot of unidentified savings to be delivered. So I don't think we are where we expected to be, albeit that the formal plan was previously to break even. I think an important change this month is that the NHS protocol has allowed us to report what we consider to be our most likely outcome rather than our most favourable outcome. And that does mean that we have now formally reported a deficit position within the ICS. Obviously, that's an important change from previous months. And in terms of financial risk, we've assessed the risks as high, and I think they will remain high because there's nothing suggesting that more money is coming over over the mountain to sort of help us out. So there's sort of no change there. I won't go through the operational performance because James will talk about that later. But just to note two things. One is the really good cancer performance, where actually the meeting of all the standards is actually really, really impressive. And in light of Jacqueline's comments about 12-hour breaches, it was good to note that they have come down in February. I think an important role of the committee at the moment is focusing on planning for next year, which does look incredibly tight, and that is occupying a lot of our focus. And actually, given the deficit position this year, the Finance Committee has decided that it will hold sort of touch point meetings between finance committees to maintain momentum in developing that plan. I think it's important to note, and we sort of had a little bit of this conversation, Jacqueline's comments about staffing. The mood music has changed. The messages from government, from the NHSE, is much more about money's got to be tighter and people have to live within their means. And if you think about what we spend our money on, a big part of our budget is on staff. And that means that we absolutely will have to review all of our staffing levels and to make tough decisions about what we can afford and what we can't afford. And whilst obviously we will need to maintain patient safety, some of the sort of nicer bits might need to be challenged in order to get nearer to balance in the coming year. There is now work across the system, and we are looking for opportunities where across the whole of the ICS we could make savings, but they will all inevitably take time to sort of get going and deliver actual savings. I won't go through the rest of the report. The only thing I thought was perhaps I would draw out is the proposal to create a joint bank staff across both ESTH and St George's, which was approved by the committee. Quite a lot of work to do, and it seems like an easy thing to do, but in reality these things are always harder, so we will need to keep a focus on that. I think hopefully the rest of the report is reasonably clear, but if not, I will be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Anne. That's really helpful. And I think the points made about next year, which obviously we'll be looking at later, are very well made, and the point about bank as well. So any questions? Phil?
Just to build on that, Chair, about next year, and obviously there's as ever, there is a lot of stress and pressure in the hospitals currently, but I suppose it's really important, if we're going to reduce the deficit next year, that we get off to a good start at the beginning of the financial year. And I suppose the question is to members of the committee, do you feel assured that we are running fast enough such that when we get to the beginning, which is only now weeks away, a small number of weeks away, we get to the start of the financial year, we're going to make inroads quickly into the deficit?
Anne, do you want to offer a view as committee chair, but then I might go to James to get a view from the executive bridge, as it were?
So certainly in my executive financial career, I wouldn't have wanted to be 3 weeks away or whatever it is from the start of the financial year and not to have had clearly identified savings plan. But I think that's the nature of our kind of starting point, really, isn't it? And I think we're some way away from actually having a formally agreed budget for next year. So I think inevitably there will be some delay in when the savings start to deliver. Having said that, I do believe that the executive teams have gripped the challenge and are working to identify savings opportunities. But my expectation is that they will be back-end loaded. I think that's inevitable from where we're starting. But I don't think that's from lack of commitment to look at it and try and identify savings opportunities.
Thank you, Anne. James?
So I think the key to this, and it's a very big number we need to hit, even for the shape of the plan we're looking at, is to break it down into slightly more manageable chunks. We know that there are a number of things through the year that might help us deliver savings. So some of the things that we're looking at in terms of how we develop corporate services, in terms of how we transform our services and also transform services across South West London, but they're going to kick in later in the year. The bit that we're very focused on as a site leadership team at the moment, Andrew has set us a very clear task in terms of the phasing that we need to hit from month 2 in terms of savings in order to keep our heads above water and to give ourselves the space for those things to kick in later in the year. So that our work in business planning is about kind of filling the hopper of SIP schemes that will actually be deliverable in the first and the second quarter. We have to be pragmatic about what that is about. So a lot of it will be about continuing things that we've done this year to enhance our controls around temporary staffing. Those need to go further. We need to take some more robust actions that build on some of the things that we've done this year. There are opportunistic schemes that are coming up from the divisions, some of which are about, how we manage the budgetary process and how we pull back on overspends from this year, and, also just make sure that the capacity we've got on the site really reflects the operational pressure we're under, because typically after Easter it tends to back off a little bit, so we need to make sure that we're taking the spend out. So I think, do I know where 5.5% or something like that's coming from? No. Have we got a process to identify where the first bit of it is coming from so that some sort of stuff can start early? Yes. And do I feel that we're further ahead than we were 12 months ago? Absolutely.
Thank you, James. That's really helpful. I don't think any of us underestimate the nature of the task, but we're equally clear, as Anne said, that the mood music is different, and this year we do need to be able to make demonstrable progress. I can't see any other hands in relation to the Finance Committee report, so I want to ask 2 things of the board. The first thing is to note the report. The second thing is to delegate to the next meeting of the Finance Committee the agreement of next year's budget, which is a kind of important technicality, because I have to say the numbers will probably still be moving, but that's just the way the NHS works. And then we have a meeting, a development day, very early in April. We will take some of that time to have a joint board meeting with George's and look at the budget as well. So it's not that people are going to be excluded from the process. Are people happy to endorse that delegation? Yes, and to note the report. Lovely, thank you. Andrew, sorry.
Sorry, a relatively minor point, but could we also just note the recommendation from the Finance Committee about the Robin Hood Lane lease as well, which is to approve it?
About the
Robin Hood Lane lease.
Yes.
Finance Committee recommended it was approved,
Yes.
so...
Yes. So it's a recommendation to the board, is it?
Yes.
Okay, so it would have been helpful if that could have been set out differently.
I was trying to reduce the volume.
No, I know, but if it's a clear recommendation that needs to be agreed by the board, it really needs to be flagged up in that way. So that's 3 elements I'm asking you. Note most of the report, agree the lease that Andrew's just referred to, and then the delegation that I described. Everyone happy? Excellent, lovely, thank you. So we move on to the People Committee. Martin.
So I'm going to focus on 3 aspects, and all the rest of it is in the report. And I'm going to focus on the assurance side of things. So the first topic is the freedom to speak up. And the committee, in terms of assurance, was particularly concerned by the increase in people reporting detriment. In other words, people saying that they've used freedom to speak up and then suffered some sort of detriment, perhaps from their line manager or others. And that's obviously of concern, and we're looking to find out more about that and to revisit it. The second is there was a lessons learned, quite a brief but good, open, honest paper around what happened with the 2p in from Mighty. And this is particularly important because other things like the joint bank could also involve TUPE. And I think the highlights of that really were that there was an acknowledgement that not enough was known about the terms and conditions, the existing terms and conditions, or the pay structures. And I think less in there, but the committee felt that another issue was that the leadership of it at the time was very much centred on HR. In other words, this is TUPE, therefore it's HR. And actually, TUPE is just a mechanism. And these kind of things are programmes, and they need stronger line management leadership. Now, not directly connected to that, but there was another assurance issue around facilities which came about like this. We've noticed for some time that roughly the vacancy rate is about 25% in estates and facilities, largely because the other issue with the mighty TUPE was that far more vacancies were TUPE'd over than we expected. And we were assured that the quality of service that patients were receiving wasn't being impacted, which was excellent to hear, because you'd think if you're short 25% of the staff, it would be. But the reason why that assurance was given was because staff were working extra hours to cover it, and therefore there was no. So we asked to see some data on how many hours staff were working, and I have to say there was a very mixed view about what we should do about the data, because there weren't many, but there were a few staff who were working very, very long hours. And there's a trend more generally that obviously in the cost of living crisis, if you're on low pay, if there's plenty of work, you can do plenty of work. And some of the committee felt that the problem with clamping down on this is that they'll just go and work elsewhere, which is absolutely right, because there's loads of work out there. And if they are working elsewhere, we wouldn't know anyway. So there was a sort of mixed view, but we were assured that that line managers monitored this very carefully to make sure that people weren't working excessive hours. And the last one I wanted to raise was assurance around payroll and essentially people being paid correctly. Because whilst we do a huge amount of really good work on well-being, clearly you have to get the basics right, like paying people on time. And in the particular area we've been focusing on is our supplier in this area answering the phone, which you can't really get any more basic than that. But the time it takes for our staff to get through, and it may not be they're being paid wrongly, they just might want to understand their pay slip, which can be quite complex. And there was a very strong feeling from the committee that really we had to put more pressure on them to improve this performance, because our staff were suffering from it. And of course it affects ultimately productivity and employee engagement. So I know Paul has got it in hand and is picking it up with the supplier. So that was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That was very clear and helpful to have those points pulled out. So questions or comments to Martin? Peter?
Just a brief comment, reflection back on the freedom to speak out issue, which, Martin, you flagged a concern because of the increase. Actually, it's an interesting point that we had quite a discussion at George's yesterday where there had been an increase, but it was almost felt to have been a positive thing that there had been an increase because there was more willingness to speak out, and this was possibly a reflection of training that had happened, so there was more awareness of the opportunities to do so. So obviously important to understand to what extent that is the case, greater awareness, positive, versus if there are underlying issues which are apparently aggravating things, clearly we need to get to the bottom of. But it was just to provide that kind of slightly different take on numbers, etc. Thank you.
You're absolutely right. But what I said was that there was an increase in the category called detriment. And I don't think there can be any positives about that. So that is cases where people's complaint is they've used freedom to speak up and they've suffered some disadvantage. So it's like the typical case would be manager afterwards retaliating in some way. and taking action against somebody because they have used the freedom to speak up, which obviously fundamentally undermines the whole thing. But I don't want to overstate it. You know, this kind of data, it doesn't really tell you that much. And that's why it's about the assurance aspects, and we were just highlighting that. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That's helpful. Stephen wants to come in. I would just remind the board that we actually do have the report on the board agenda because of the importance of the subject. But Stephen, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say I was going to touch on the detriment point when we got to that agenda item. I mean, Martin, you're absolutely right. I mean, the numbers for detriment are a concern. The fact that they're rising is a concern. As you say, don't overplay it, but all cases where staff report detriment for speaking up, we're required to report to the National Guardian's Office. They take it very seriously. They expect us to look into the reasons that might be causing that. It's not always easy to establish what those are. One of the things that we do try and do is to make clear to staff and managers at all levels that, you know, we do not tolerate staff suffering detriment for speaking up. And James and I have done sessions with staff where we've made that exact point. And where we do get that, we flag them to areas. We make sure that we're reporting them to the Guardian. So we do take that very seriously. And as you say, there's no positive to take from that.
Indeed, there is not. I can't see any other hand. Oh, sorry, Paul.
Just a very, very small point, which doesn't offer very much assurance, but one of the points that Phil and I picked up when we spoke to a colleague from Mighty this morning was on the issue around, do you get any pressure to work more hours? And he was absolutely adamant that he didn't, and we really pressed on it. So it's a sample size of 1, so not very helpful, but it's better than the opposite.
Indeed it is, Paul, and I get quite a lot of feedback from that group of staff, and I've never had feedback about being pushed to do hours they don't want to do. Again, that's just another fragment in the overall picture. So I definitely can't see any other hands now. So if I could ask colleagues to note that report, and we will move on to 21D, the Audit Committee report. Peter.
Thank you, Gillian. This is a report of the meeting on the 27th of January. I just would like to highlight a few of the issues that we focused on, the first of which was around the annual report and accounts, which we were advised that we'd need to submit by the end of June, 30th of June. We were assured that we're on track for that in terms of both the internal arrangements to do so, but also the external audit process was being put in place. Worth just noting, it will be new auditor, external auditor this time, Grant Thornton. We have an agreement for this year. They are the current auditors for George's, so they've got an awareness of some of the group issues and the etc. But that will mean some changes, no doubt, in how it's approached, but we're confident that those can and will be managed. On the internal audit front, 2 or 3 reports with reasonable, moderate assurance, so that was fine. And we were assured again that the plan was on track. Again, just noting there will be a change of internal auditor this coming year, which I'll come on to shortly, but nonetheless it will require some transition handover planning to make sure that that's all seamless and things don't kind of fall between the cracks. I mentioned just briefly the managing conflicts requirements, where new kind of process tools in place. Things historically been a bit behind where we'd like to be on the target for people's declarations on managing conflicts, but nonetheless I think the hope is that with the new systems in place that will now be catching up towards and reaching the target level by the end of the financial year. Then finally, this notes the outcome of the internal audit tender, which, just as a brief reminder, this is where we agreed to go out collaboratively with other trusts within South West London to see if we could arrive at a point of having a common provider. We got a good way towards that outcome, but with Kingston decided they would prefer to step outside and retaining their existing auditor, KPMG. So we will, we have nonetheless proceeded along with Croydon to proceed with RSM as our new internal auditor lead, and they will be in place for the 23-24 plan, which comes back to the point we need to manage the transfer from the existing internal audit leads as we go into next year. There's a limited amount of time, but again, hopefully that will be managed. So it does mean, in summary, that we now have a common provider with the South West London ISB, along with the Mental Health Trust, and with Croydon. And so that in itself should facilitate sharing a good practice around the outcomes of the internal audit process, which is, again, positive. But to try and cement a slightly stronger, and not to exclude Kingston from that sharing a good process, I'll be writing out shortly to all chairs and their lead executives to put in place a forum on internal audit to share good practice and other learnings across this region, and I'll be writing out shortly to do that. I think there will be a positive response, which is a good sign in the spirit of promoting collaboration. So that should be in hand. All right, that's all for now. Thank you, Gillian.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, and for that initiative you've taken around audit. It's a disappointment that Kingston didn't join in, but we understand the reasons. So, questions or comments to Peter? So, Martin.
Yeah, is there much of a cost saving from this combining auditors?
Maybe marginal, but my recollection is the price wasn't the dominant factor in the end. What we were keen to ensure, particularly at a time when there's so much change happening, that the quality was paramount. And that's the assurance we were given, I think, through the kind of due diligence and quite intensive discussions and the tender process confirmed that in terms of the balance we struck, the successful bid at RSN came out strongly on quality. I think a good price, but we didn't want to compromise the outcomes by going for the cheapest on offer. I think that's a fair summary, but I look to Steve, who was very closely involved in the process as well.
Steve, is there anything you need to add before I bring Derek in?
Nothing on that point.
Okay.
I had another.
Yes, Martin, please.
Okay, on a completely different subject, and thanks for that. The salary overpayments, which, if you go back, was a huge issue at Epsom and St Helier at one point, and I'm sure lots of work's carried on, but we haven't actually looked at it for a while. I just wanted help to understand the numbers, because it says the average monthly identified overpayment was 72,000, and in 22-23, year to date has been 137, and then it goes on to various other numbers. And the last sentence, the Trust continues to work with SPS payroll team and HR to address the 823,000 outstanding overpayment and ensure recovery. Do you or somebody understand those numbers?
It's the historic stuff, isn't it?
Yeah. Basically, taking that last point first, there is currently 2.2 million in total outstanding for salary overpayments, of which 798 has been invoiced. So we've had contact with the person who received the overpayment and either have agreed or have invoiced them for the outstanding debt. So we believe that's in recovery. So we are in some debate or discussion or active process of recovery. 382,000 is being repaid via agreed plans. So that's probably the existing members of staff or leavers who've said, I'll pay you £100 a month to discharge the debt. So it's in recovery. So that, and some of those will be quite extended periods of time. But, you know, I wouldn't, while that debt is outstanding, it is in a process of recovery. So we are confident we will get that back. And then the balance, if you add those two together and take it off the 2.2, that 823 is where we are seeking contact or have had no contact from the person who received the overpayment. That will invariably be for people who have left. A significant amount of our overpayments relate to someone. We do not terminate the individual when they leave, and therefore we continue to pay them. It becomes difficult to then find them sometimes and recover the money. So that is why one of the key controls around salary overpayments is effective termination of people as they resign. That is the single most effective action that we can take in terms of addressing this problem. And that needs to exist, you know, locally within management teams, and that's one of the key areas we're focusing on. So that 800,000 is where, as I say, we are seeking to engage with the person who received the overpayment, but we either do not have a forwarding address or they are not responding to us.
Okay, so there has obviously been a huge improvement in the rate of overpayment as I read those numbers then.
well, you can look at it several ways. We are seeing the rate of identified overpayment increasing at the moment. So the average is up. But we are attributing that because we are more actively looking at the process and we are finding more. What tended to happen in the past is we found them over a prolonged period of time. Now we found a lot, if you see what I mean, because we've actively reviewed everyone who's on the payroll, if that makes sense. So we've gone out to every department and said, we're paying these people, should we be? And they've come back and said, well, no, Tina or Bob or whoever has left, so we can stop them. So that active process means, but we identify more in a short period of time. We're expecting now the average value we identify to reduce, because A, we should be terminating people more effectively, and B, our processes should ensure that if someone does get overpaid for a termination, we identify them more quickly. i.e. we don't overpay them for 6 months, we might overpay them for 1. So again, we should see the value reduce. That is not the only cause of overpayments, but it's certainly one of the material ones.
Okay, Martin. There must be an awful lot of history behind it, given some of the numbers, Andrew, but I don't think we need to go there now. Derek?
Well, my point was actually exactly the same, so I won't reiterate. Well, I think merits emphasis. That the thing that strikes you about this is there assurance from, at the committee level that going forward we can reduce overpayments? I mean, there's only a limited amount you could do to recover funds from people who've been paid and walked away with the money and now have disappeared. But going forward, was the committee sufficiently assured that we have a system to ensure that when someone leaves, that the salary stops? I mean, I'm very conscious of how hard it is to employ someone and how many steps you go through to employ someone, but at the end of employment, is there a sort of, like a black hole that people just go into and keep being paid? But it might be, Phil, we've had enough discussion on this, but I did want to just flag that it's the one thing
I
that
think it's
stood
an
out at me.
entirely valid point, Derek. I think some of what Andrew said was helpful in answering your question, but I think it's for Peter as chair to summarise how he feels the committee feels. Peter, do you mind?
Yeah, no, thanks, and very reasonable question, Derek. I mean, I think we're assured that progress is being made, improvements are happening, but there's still some way to go. There's the wider issues around payroll, and I think Martin's committee has a key role to play in ensuring that. It's important there's the ownership at the local level. As say, prevention is better than cure, and the more we can stop it happening at first base, the better. So let me put it this way, we'll be keeping our eyes on it, Derek. We're not letting go on it, despite the fact that improvements have been made, but there's some way to go yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Martin, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, just very quickly, just to note, the other side of this is, of course, where it's overpayment and their existing staff, very often people do not know that they have been overpaid, and there is potential hardship once we get into recovery. I'm not sure, and it's not appropriate for here, how much we determine that, how much SBS as an outsourced supplier do the recovery plans, but we do need, especially at this time of all the issues going on with the NHS and the cost of living, just to be mindful about the wellness aspects of it for staff if they've been overpaid and do not realise it.
Thank you, Martin. That's absolutely right. And I think we've given a very clear kind of steer as board about the need for, of course, recovering public money, but doing it in a way that is sympathetic to staff and recognises that it can become very complicated when they've lost benefits as a result of overpayment and things. And I think at a meeting, a couple of meetings ago, James indicated, James Blythe that is, that he was aware of the issue and that there would be sensitivity applied. And I think at some point it would be quite useful if Audit Committee could pick up on some of that detail, actually. Andrew, and then I need to try and close this down.
Yeah, and just on that point, the 300,000 that we have in recovery is an illustration of the fact we do agree extended recovery periods with a lot of people. A lot of the angst we see is when we are accused of pushing people into hardship. And SBF has a standard set of processes which they enact if there is no engagement from the individual. And one of the things we often find is we will write 3 or 4 times, and SBS will write to someone who's received an overpayment, and we will have no communication back. What happens then is we move into the default process where if they're still an employee, we then do move into a recovery process. that gets their attention. But we will engage and agree appropriate recovery processes with them. It is unfortunate, I'd rather not be in that place, but it's a great way of getting people's attention. We try every reasonable endeavour to get hold of people, but a lot of people do not come back to us.
Well, I think we understand, Andrew, for some of the very hard cases where the benefits have been lost. I mean, there's just fear, actually. So I don't want to get lost in the detail of this. I know that the executive are sensitive to the point because we've discussed it previously. And I do think we've given a very clear steer in the past. It's public money, so we have a duty to recover it, but we have to do it in a way which is compassionate and recognises that for some of our staff, this is very, very hard. They're not well paid, and the loss of benefits and all the rest of it makes the situation much worse. Stephen, you wanted to come in.
Just two very quick things. One was on the internal audit tender and specifically around the transition. So this process, in terms of audit committees considering the outcome of that process, that took place at the end of January, and the contract award period has gone on during February, probably taken a little bit longer than we would ideally have wanted during February. All suppliers have been informed last week, and the beginning of this week received feedback. So we're now at a point where that transition is now really starting, and I've got an initial meeting around that with RSM on Monday afternoon to start that process, and that will work its way through in terms of process. The exec team, side teams will all feed into developing that, and that plan will come to the audit committee in April. The second point was around declarations of interest, and just, we've introduced a new portal to boost compliance. I probably wouldn't overstate the under compliance at Epsom and St Helier previously. We did have a counter fraud report that the audit committee had last July, which was quite positive actually. This was about strengthening processes and making that better. We only rolled this new portal out just before Christmas, so it's been in operation for about 2.5 months. Because of the timing in the year where we set a 50% compliance rate target for the year. Today we're at 53%. So we've staff have been really, really good at engaging with this system and really, really pleased about that.
Good. I get a weekly note from them. I think I've done everything I need to do, but I'm chased weekly, so I'm not sure what that means. Anyway, that's a completely separate issue. Could we note the audit committee report, please? Yeah, thank you very much. That takes us on to the estates assurance. Anne.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the report from the meeting on the 27th of January. We are still, despite the corporate governance team's best efforts, struggling to get dates in the diary for this committee. And people will recall that we set this up, I think, initially for a year. So we might need to formally agree that it will continue beyond the year, because I do think we've not yet completed the task that we set out, and I think there was a point Stephen made earlier about agreeing some criteria about at what point do we think we've done enough and we can hand it into a business as usual, and we certainly don't think that we are there yet. So on the 27th of February we had a small group, but perfectly formed group that did its due diligence as well as it could, and we looked at the subject of medical gases, and I won't go through all the different things that we looked at. We gave it a thorough testing, and we were satisfied that we thought the systems around medical gases were working well, and in particular because we were cognizant of the fact that there had been some issues around oxygen during COVID. That had been a particularly challenging issue, and that was now, some changes have been made, and that was now working well. So we've over the times that we've met, we've looked at low voltage, electricity, water, ventilation, medical gases, various other things. We think we've still got decontamination and high voltage electricity still to do. But all of that does, and Andrew's sort of laughing, this is your world, isn't it? So we work our way through. But then I think there's quite an important point where we need as a committee to sort of review all of it and say, particularly in the light of the kind of now well publicised delays to the new hospital programme, what does that mean going forward? Because we've got systems in place that might have kept, particularly St Helier, functioning for a few years, and it's becoming increasingly clear that the view is going to be a bit more than that. And I think before we can really discharge our responsibilities, we need to say, what does that mean for the estate? Because obviously we've not wanted to invest in estate that wasn't going to be part of our future. But actually the difference between a further 3 years and maybe a further 7 or 8 years is quite material for some of our buildings. So I think we've still got that piece of work to do before we can hand it back to what will go to the Finance Committee in common. So we probably need to formally accept as a board that needs to continue. And no doubt we will continue to struggle to find a regular date for these meetings, which means that we never quite have a full house of people there. But that Phil and I did our best, didn't we, to provide the non-exec challenge on that.
And I'm sure you do it most effectively, if I might say so. Thank you for that, Anne. Any questions on the report, Phil?
Just to sort of build on what Anne said, and I think probably medical gases is a very good example, because we were assured that it was all in good shape, but that is based on the estate we've got. So there's a long list of things that we could improve, down to basic things like knowing exactly where the pipes are and things like that, and having drawings of them, because they're not up to date necessarily. But that is acceptable when one's got a team that one's got which knows the medical gas layout well. So there's a combination of things that make these things work, I would say, but it's living with, it's like anyone living with in an old house or whatever. You get to know how it works, and therefore you need people who care in the team to ensure it does work. And that's what, and we're assuring that, if you like, at the same time as the hardware.
I think that's a neat way of putting it, Phil. I can't see any other hands, so I'd like to ask the board to note the report, but to agree the point that Anne made about the committee needing to go on beyond a year, both to deal with the two specifics, but that broader point that Anne and Phil have effectively described. I'm sure everyone will be content for that to happen. It's an important piece of assurance. We can't hand it back to Finance Committee until all that detail's been gone through. Everyone happy? Jacqueline?
So I am happy, so it wasn't an unhappy hand.
No, I realise, but you wanted to make another
But
point.
I think as we were talking about that, it was also pinging through my head about, and also then how do we continue assurance without having a specific board? So what does that look like? So that it was just in my head, because we know we need to use the PAM a bit more in anger. So it's just that next bit for the...
Well, the same point applies to George's, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I think that's probably something Andrew's already been giving thought to, and no doubt that will emerge sooner rather than later, Andrew, yeah? Yeah, great, okay. People happy to move on to 21F, Surrey Downs Health and Care Partnership Board and Sutton Health and Care. In Chris's absence, Thurza, sorry, it's not really right that an executive should, but it's not really an assurance report, let's be clear. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. There was one point that Chris asked that I raised at the board, and it does relate to the integrated risk register, particularly in relation to Sutton Health and Care. And it's really the delta between two of the risks, which is patient complexity and availability of workforce. I think that the board has focused particularly on workforce in relation to recruitment and retention, and looking at ensuring that we have safe staffing levels. We now have an increasing focus on, with the use of bank and particularly agency staff, how we look at ensuring safe care and quality care to our patients, remembering, of course, that our patients are in homes and therefore not visible to if people aren't being visited. So there is a particular focus in Sutton at understanding both how we look at a different style of leadership that ensures that we do provide that oversight both to the team and to the patients, and looking at how we create the the conditions to identify early if there are any problems. So there is a big piece of work going on looking at both the clinical caseloads, the safe staffing, but particularly the culture, the communications, and the environment for psychological safety, focusing around our district nursing services within our primary care networks.
Thank you, Thurza. That's understood and very clear. Any questions or comments for Thurza? Peter?
Thanks, Thurza. Just to ask whether it's on here or the next report about whether you're comfortable with the progress being made on delayed discharges. Now, this keeps on coming up and we'll keep on asking, no doubt, but given it's such a critical issue, are there any things that more needs to be done, or are you happy with where things are at the moment?
I thought I might save that for the performance report, but happy to cover it now if that's
No, I
makes more
think
sense.
deal with
Yeah.
it under the performance report. If you're okay with that, Peter?
Yeah, very happy.
Okay, great. So if we could note that report, and it takes us on to item 2.2, the integrated quality and performance report. And we're a few minutes late. I think we're okay because there's scope to catch up, but I might just have to remind people to be brief. James.
I'll take that as a gentle reminder to be brief. I'll take the
It was
report.
general, not specific.
I'll take the report as read. In terms of key performance successes and challenges to identify, on the planned care side, I think we continue to see a reduction in the overall size of the waiting list, which I think is extremely positive in the context of double-digit percentage increases in referrals that we've seen through most of this year. Whilst in aggregate that appears now to be deliverable, and we have some real successes in some specialties, which have been supported by the work that we've done on outpatient transformation. They've also been supported by some of the pathway changes that we've been able to make across South West London and locally with our GPs in terms of optimising the referrals we get, making sure we're only getting the right patients, etc. There are a couple of areas that are proving much more intractable to get a sustainable balance of capacity and demand on, and you very much see that in the 52-week waiters. So I think two particular to highlight: gynecology. So we've received about 13,000 gynecology referrals in the last year, so over 1,000 a month, and that is simply unsustainable. There are not the gynecologists out there to see that number of patients. Now, we're looking to have a South West London-wide discussion about this, because actually it's a common issue in a number of providers to understand what we need to do in terms of the sort of differential management of different types of gynecology patients. We're also working with the Sutton GPs to see what more, with some additional consultant and physio support, can be managed in the local community, because we're simply just never going to find the staffing to manage that level of demand. The second area is community paediatrics, and again, there are significant discussions both amongst the acutes about how to balance demand for community paediatrics between us, but also with the wider community and local authority community about how we make best use of our community paediatrician time, because our consultants spend a significant amount of their time discharging statutory duties for local authorities, and without some of that time back, we're simply never going to be able to meet the very significant increase that we've seen in referrals, particularly connected to autism. So, the real concern about those two areas. Work ongoing, but if they were simple to fix, we would have fixed them by now, and the solutions are not going to lie entirely within the gift of ESTH or indeed the group. Should also flag that we have had some challenges around diagnostic waiting times, particularly around echocardiography and MRI. There are mitigations that we're putting in place to try and recover that position as quickly as possible. There are some specific challenges around estates and capital, particularly around MRI, that Andrew and I are working closely together on to make sure that we maximise the uptime that we've got of our MRI scanners, because that's causing us some specific challenges at the moment. But we do hope to recover that position to some extent over the next few months. Really positive that we've sustained cancer performance through a really difficult period, and it remains a key area of focus. I think not just in terms of the headline figures, but making sure that we're actually getting people the diagnosis and treatment they need in an effective way. Going through into the non-elective side, whilst we have continued to be under very significant pressure, in terms of the key metrics, we actually saw a slightly better month in January than December. I think that one of the consequences of having the ambulance strikes is that we did quite a lot of things in a very escalated way. So we changed some of our processes. We had, a real focus on the flow out of ED and making sure, as you saw with AMU earlier, a bed opens up on AMU, 20 minutes later there's another patient in it. And that is, some of that flow is a legacy of some of the work that we've been doing on the day flow on site, making sure that we're moving patients up, particularly where we know we've got discharges coming up and that we've got a real focus on that flow. And you see that in the 4 and 12-hour delay numbers, and you also see it in the ambulance handover numbers. My note of caution is that both for that and also for the fact that we're seeing reduced patients with no criteria to reside, so reduced patients who shouldn't be in the hospital, we have had quite a bit of, we've put in quite a bit of resource and we've had quite a bit of support in terms of funding, non-recurrent winter pressures funding to do it, and a lot of that funding drops off at the end of this month. So, the demand won't necessarily, we know Easter is really busy, so I think working out how we sustain some of those productivity improvements, some of those flow improvements, when we're not necessarily going to have some of the things in place that we've had in place, or they would be an additional cost pressure, is going to be a really significant challenge for us as a site. So I think those were probably the key performance challenges and successes that I wanted to highlight. I think probably helpful to hand over to Arlene to talk about any of the quality challenges.
Well, I was just going to ask Thurza to deal with the delayed discharges point, and then check in with Arlene and Ruth, and then take questions. Thank you, James. Thurza, do you want to deal with Peter's question?
I think the question was, am I satisfied with progress? I'm satisfied with progress, but I think we could do more, which I think is the position that we are in. I'm looking at both Surrey Downs and Sutton, which are the two areas that we focus upon. We've made real progress in terms of people going home with packages of care. We have some innovative schemes. So in Surrey Downs, we now have the Recovery at Home team, which is a hybrid team between social care and health and can provide that short-term cover. We've used some of the winter pressures money that we have to look at how we can discharge people from acute sites into care homes when they are self-funders. And that's quite a change in practice, and it is making a real difference. As James said, the issue is going to be for those schemes, how do we continue them? We're doing a piece of work that looks at which schemes were effective and how do we continue them into the new year rather than drop them off the cliff. I think the area in both Sutton and Surrey Downs where there is still more work to be done, but it's not something we can do alone. We can only be the pressure to other people, is to look at people with the most complex needs and how do we work with care homes to make them confident to accept those people for discharges. They are the people that are taking the longest amount of time. We've done a lot of work with care homes around how we support, as I mentioned earlier, but there is the issue of funding as well. So I think there is, particularly in the Surrey area, a reluctance to break a threshold, maybe in the Southern area as well, to break a threshold in terms of how much will be paid. And I think that is a national debate as much as it is a regional debate or a local debate. So I think that's where we have the biggest area to improve. Looking at the graphs, which of course I now have in much more detail, you can also see, coming back to the conversation there was earlier, if you look in Surrey Downs, the number of people who are on the end-of-life care pathway, who are staying in a long time in hospital, and if you imagine that you would want that to be zero, you want people to die in their preferred place of death, that is one of the areas of focus that we have. We will now focus about how do we stop people coming in if that's not the right thing for them, but actually making sure that people can be discharged to the appropriate setting, I think is one of our biggest quality and outcome measures that we really should be focusing on as well.
Thank you, Thurza, that's really helpful. Arlene, anything you need to flag up? given you've got another couple of reports.
I know, so I won't talk a lot, but just to say for F. Simmons and Hillyer, the challenge in fundamentals of care continues to be around VTE risk assessments and dementia and MOST, but as highlighted in the report from Quality Committee, there is a lot of work going on, and deep dives and action plans are being developed. So we're content that that is working and improving all the time. But I really wanted to highlight for that there has been a huge decrease in falls in inpatient areas, and I think that is in part due to the enhanced care. So that's why we need to balance, how we look at enhanced care, because we've got a decrease in falls in inpatient areas, a 54% decrease in falls in community. In the inpatient areas as well, and only one fall with severe harm. And of course we want that to be 0, but if you think we were having double digits at one point, only one fall with severe harm. So we really just do need to balance the look at the enhanced care, because that's why we put that in. And in terms of complaints for F. Simmons and Hillyer, compliance in terms of the 25-day response time is only 58%, but we are looking at how we address that with the work that we're doing around group integration, so that we can put in systems that we can get support across while the team works on the backlog as well. So just those for me.
And right to highlight them, particularly the falls, Arlene. That's really good to see. Ruth.
Thank you. So I was just really going to highlight the work that's ongoing around mortality rates within Epsom St Helier, which is actually laid out here in the slide deck. So you'll know it's been a subject of great focus really over the last sort of 9 to 12 months. The work carries on at individual patient level to scrutinise deaths and look for any issues and any learning. I think my summary there would be that we've not identified, despite significant deep dives, any systemic themes that have emerged that require further focus and attention. At the moment, the deep dives that we're doing relate to cardiac arrest on the inpatient ward, looking for any themes and learning there, and also look to how we care for our oldest, frailest patients with malignancies when they need surgery. So those are our focuses at the moment. 2 other areas I think just to flag. You might remember that back in the autumn there was a piece of work undertaken that looked at how we capture comorbidities, potentially relevant when we look at the end-of-life care pathways. And what we highlighted was that we weren't optimally coding the complexity of our patients. So we've got a work stream underway there with a pilot underway in renal. And then I think finally we note that from April reporting changes, so that you'll know this trust has been capturing its same-day emergency care data differently to trusts elsewhere in the country. From April the 1st, that changes nationally, so we may see a move in data consequently through the summer and next autumn. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, for explaining that so clearly, and thank you for your leadership of this area. I know you've put a huge amount of personal effort into it, and it's very much appreciated. So, comments or questions from board colleagues? Phil, Peter.
Just wanted to raise, and I know James has already highlighted this, but the children weights really, so over 52 weeks, 129, and it seems a large number, and I know you mentioned a bit, but could you say a little bit more about how we might tackle that, because it just seems like something that's, as you read the reports, it stares out a bit like a sore thumb. So
it's a really significant problem. The majority of these children, so community paediatrics, the majority of the clinical caseload is children with a developmental challenge or with a potential neurodevelopmental diagnosis such as autism. There are a number of routes we need to go down. I mean, it should be said that we have significant vacancies within the community paediatric workforce. We are continually trying to recruit, not just at consultant level, but also at specialty doctor level, to see if there are any more people we can bring in. The reality is that we haven't trained this workforce in sufficient numbers, and we are not training this workforce in sufficient numbers currently for the fact that there's a very significant increase in the demand. The routes to tackling it are going to be multifaceted. The first is about making sure that we are only seeing patients who really need some input from a paediatrician. So if a diagnosis of a condition is solely being sought in order to, for example, access educational support, that's not an appropriate use of clinical time. And actually, we need to make sure that we are inputting to processes around, let's say, education, health and care plans in a way that means that we can provide clinical input to what a child needs rather than diagnose a child and then that lead to a conversation about what a child needs. That's the first thing. So working with local authorities on there. We work with Sutton and Merton from the St Helier service on the processes around how we make sure that we don't use diagnosis as a sort of gateway, really. The second area is making sure that we use the full range of staff within the service. So are there children who can be triage and can potentially be seen by one of our very senior and experienced nurses instead of needing to be seen by a paediatrician. The third area, and I think that this is the one that will be need the most system engagement, will ultimately be about what our paediatricians are doing, because there's been a massive move over the last 10 to 15 years to look for designated and named paediatrician doctor roles to lead on looked after children, safeguarding, special educational needs and disabilities, and adoption as well. So we spend quite a bit of time supporting, giving medical advice to adoption panels. Now, some of these things need to be done, but currently they're done for every single local authority separately by a community paediatric team. And the area that we are beginning to explore is whether across a geography like South West London, there might be a more effective way of organising this medical input to those services. The challenge we have is that we deal with 2 boroughs. Across South West London there are 6, and there are 6 individual London boroughs, and actually the doctors are primarily interacting with the London boroughs for this service. So I don't want to sort of prejudge how where the London boroughs might get to on this, because actually it requires the trusts and the paediatricians and the London boroughs and some of the other related community services to work together in a very different way. And I think that's why it's proving so challenging. The waits are a little bit worse at some other organisations, and they're a little bit better at some other organisations. And actually what we see here, sadly, is sort of in the middle of the pack. I am assured, Phil, that there is more of a sense of urgency now, because this is coming up as an issue for everyone, whereas I think 6 months ago we felt that we were a little bit of an outlier. So it's going to take all of that, and as you can tell from the level of detail, it's something that a lot of us are quite intimately involved in trying to sort at the moment.
It was indeed very helpful, James, and I still don't think you need a doctor to do the looked after children check. It can be done by a nurse, but it would only free up a small amount of time, but lots of small amounts of time will make a difference here. Peter.
Thank you. And 2 points. First, just to congratulate James and the team for maintaining performance levels in some of the most challenging circumstances over the last few months, and actually drawing on the benefits of the crisis, if you like, to trial new ways of working and then bringing those into business as usual, I think is great that that's now happening. So nonetheless, well done. But secondly, I just wanted to pick up something which has been mentioned a few times in feedback from ward visits, which is about ward accreditation. And I just wondered, and maybe we could get something a bit more detailed by way of follow-up, but it does seem to be quite a key to motivating staff, ensuring, underpinning patient safety, no doubt a good kind of retention issue if staff are well motivated. So for all those good reasons, but I don't have a lot of sense of where we stand overall. Are we on track? Are most wards now at gold or silver? Is there more that needs to be done? And what do you have a sense of what your plan is for the coming year, Arlene? Thank you.
Is there a quick answer to that? Because actually it's quite a big question.
It is
No, it's a good question, Peter, but I'm just conscious that it in a sense, it would merit a kind of item on its own, really.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is. And we are doing a review of accreditation across the board, because we've realised that what we measure is not necessarily aligned. So that work has started, and we do have the detail about who's gold and silver and aiming for platinum, but it's going to be a bigger view. The plan going forward is that we look at it across the group so that we are aligned. With George's is far advanced in terms of their journey with award accreditation, but now that we have Steph in post, she's going to take the helm on leading on, looking at how we do it so that we do it in the same way.
I think it would, and I do think Peter's point was a good one, and Stephen, you're probably going to hate me for saying this, but is it something that Quality Committee could take a look at? I think we don't have the full picture across either trust, really, and it would be really useful. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Would that help, Peter?
It would be very helpful.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I can't see any of the hands, I'm not encouraging them. But I think we've had a really good debate, and I thought there were 2 points that are just worth emphasising. The Easter challenge that James referred to, and the problem with the money that will have run out. And Arlene's point about falls and the impact that enhanced care has had on that. And that reminds us that the money issue next year is going to be very challenging. And in order to keep in budget, there will be consequences. I just thought it was worth, there's been a theme throughout this morning's meeting, but I thought it was worth picking up those 2 points that both Arlene and James had made and reflecting back the financial reality of that. So if people are happy to note the report, which always seems such an inadequate conclusion to a full debate, and move on to item 2.3, the maternity services report, which has of course been to Quality Committee. Arlene.
Yes, it has. So I won't rehearse, and we had an update on what was discussed at Quality Committee. I think 2 points, or maybe a couple of points to point out for Epsom and St Helier is that the CNST was not achieved, but the trust, we have submitted a bid for some funding to support the work that we need to do. We've had a few questions of clarification back from them, and we have submitted those responses, so we hope that we will know soon whether we get that money and are able to progress that piece of work. I think it's good to note as well that the performance in training compliance has gone from 21 to 88% for Epsom and St Helier, which reflects the work that the team are doing, and I think that is great improvement for that team, and they will continue to work towards ensuring that they achieve that. We still don't know what the year 6, or if there will be a year 6 CNST scheme. We haven't heard that yet, so hopefully we will do by the end of March. And one final thing for Epsom St Helier is that there has been a small spike again in 3rd and 4th degree tears, but all the retrospective looks that we have done so far have not shown any issues that we need to be working on. But there is a big audit on being undertaken actually of all, not just for Epsom and St Helier, but across Southwest London, and we should get some results on that soon.
Thank you, Arlene. Any questions or comments from colleagues on this report? The anaesthetist training remains very low, doesn't it?
So I think there's been a...
Sorry, I didn't want to start off a debate, but it does kind of shine out at you, doesn't it, in a negative way?
It does. So I think part of the challenge has been aligning the training across the different specialties. So across maternity, between midwives and obstetricians, it's been comparatively easy to do the training. I think bringing in other departments into play has proved more challenging. But let's say there's very careful micromanagement at the moment with individuals being required to attend training, and I think the confidence that it will improve significantly.
Thank you, Ruth. That's helpful to know. Are people happy to note the report? We're also asked if we've got any further helpful suggestions to make, but I think there is such a thorough a look at all the maternity stuff, both through Quality Committee and at board, that we probably don't have any other helpful suggestions to make. So thank you, Arlene, for that. So if we could move on then to the Healthcare Associated Infection Report, also being to Quality Committee. Over to you, Arlene.
Sorry, thanks, Gillian. Can I just add one more thing? I forgot to say that on maternity,
Of course, yes.
that we are expecting a CQC visit of maternity
Yes.
by the end of March, and the team here are doing all of the preparatory work. We're working across groups, so as I said at George's board, we have agreed to do mock inspections, and the mock inspection of the Epsom and St Helier, well, mostly St Helier site has happened, and I'm waiting on the outcome of that, but they didn't have any major concerns, so it's just little things that we need to work on.
So thank you for that. We'll add that to the minute because it's an important point. And we should probably also formally note that Quality Committee exercised its delegated authority around CSNT.
CNST.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I got the S in the wrong place. I'll never get it in the right place, will I? Because it's fixed there now. So back to item 2.4.
So not much to say for Epsom and St Helier. Flu numbers did go up for Epsom and St Helier, but and we are now noticing a rise in COVID cases as well. But the teams continue to work together across the group, particularly around decision making, so that we're aligned with mask wearing and all of the other precautions that we need to take. The highlight, I suppose, for Epsom and St Helier is that the Legionella incidents that we have been managing have all been closed down. There was a delay in moving into the new area that was designed for Croft because of Legionella, but those have all been, new samples have been taken, and Croft actually moved into their new premises in January, which is quite positive. And the Aspergillus cases, again, that we have been managing have all been closed down, and the actions. And I think the most important bit was about ensuring that we had ongoing audits to ensure that the actions remain in place, because that's what happened. People forgot. And so that is all ongoing, but nothing else to add.
That's good to hear. Thank you, Arlene. Questions or comments from colleagues on this report? Can't see any.
Can I ask
Of
it
course,
just,
can. Yes. Do. While I get to the
I'm just looking at the. It's a question I don't understand why. So I was looking at the influenza bits, and I looked at December for George's, and you think, Lordy, that's why we were struggling. 251 patients with flu, but we didn't start actually capturing the data Epsom St Helier till. So is there an issue for the reason for that, and will that happen next year differently? Sorry, it's just a point of I don't understand why.
Yeah.
So there is a reason, and that was because the tests at Epsom and St Helier were having to go to George's for testing, and we weren't always getting the feedback loop in time, but they've solved that. So
good.
The testing will be an ongoing.
Thank you.
Reporting will be ongoing. The testing was happening. It's just
it's just the reporting. Yes, thank you.
Good. Okay, so we're asked to receive the report for assurance, which I think we can definitely do, and we've noted before actually the vaccination position, which we're not happy about, but we recognise that apparently we're not that bad in comparative terms. Yeah, no, but we take no pleasure in that. Well, I guess it's good to be at the top of the tree, but the tree's too small, isn't it? If that's the right analogy. Right, moving on. We've pretty well caught up, thank goodness. So I'm going to move on to item 3.1, which is the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian report. Sadly, our Freedom to Speak Up Guardian is unwell, so Stephen's going to lead on this, Stephen, as the relevant executive.
Have you missed the finance report?
Have I?
No, have we done that? Sorry. No, it says healthcare on my bit, or maybe it's, because I'm looking at that, it's like yesterday. You got put in the wrong way.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
And we're on the Freedom to Speak Up report.
So
on this occasion, ignore the Chief Executive. On this occasion only. Stephen.
So obviously we've started talking about issues relevant to this report earlier on in the People Committee report. So I won't sort of recap the issues that we've covered there. I guess what I'd start by saying is normally we would have, and it would be good practice to have the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian herself presenting the report to the board and hear directly from the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian, as the George's board did yesterday. As a number of board members are aware, the Epsom and St Helier Freedom to Speak Up Guardian is away from the Trust at the moment, unwell. We're hoping she'll be back soon. And I just wanted to say the two deputy Freedom to Speak Up guardians, Tina Watson and Rebecca Strutton, have done an excellent job in taking the service forward during an extended period of leave for Moira. So really, I just want to put on record for the minutes my thanks to those for working really hard and showing enormous dedication during what has been a really difficult time for the team. So just wanted to note that. In terms of the report itself, I mean, I won't go through the details of what's in there. I mean, it covers an extended period, so it covers the first 3 quarters of the year to date. And I guess the key takeaways are the volume of cases. So we're up at 298 April to December. That's a year-on-year increase, and you can see the trend over the 3 quarters of the year is for more cases raised with Freedom to Speak Up as we've gone through the year. As Peter was intimating earlier, you know, the fact that people are feeling comfortable in raising matters with the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian is positive. You know, people accessing the service suggests that people are aware how to raise it, feel comfortable how to raise concerns, etc. So that's positive. But as we talked about earlier, there are some concerning trends within that too, not least the detriment issue that we discussed earlier. I think the other thing is that one thing that's been quite stark over the past year is there have been a number of very complex cases that have come up through Freedom to Speak Up that by their very nature take quite a bit of management unpacking. And I think, you know, the fact that those issues have come up through Freedom to Speak Up have been positive. It's led to an organisational response to deal with them. But, you know, they are by their nature complex and do take some time to resolve. I guess the themes to sort of flag, one is just drawing your attention to the particular themes coming out of Freedom to Speak Up cases. So particularly in relation to line management practices, bullying and harassment, discrimination, pay issues. We've touched on detriment and also some ongoing safety issues. Those are the broad themes that are coming up through the Guardian's reporting. And then the staff groups that are using the service the most, nursing midwifery, admin and clerical, and estates and facilities. So those are the 3 broad things. Timeliness in resolving concerns remains a bit of an issue, and there are very many reasons for that, the complex cases being one. One of the positive things is I think that the Guardian service is having good engagement with the site leadership team, and that's really positive in taking things forward. We're exploring what more we can do, so looking at sort of an early case management discussion with the site leadership team to work out how best we can get those cases picked up by the right people, focused in the right way, get the regular updates in time. So that's one of the things we're looking at. And I think there's a number of things we can do to sort of progress and escalate matters. I won't go through the detail of the individual things coming through, other than to say that I think the next part of this is looking to see how we can then adopt a common approach across the group to how we have a consistent policy, how we have a consistent set of processes around Freedom to Speak Up, so that staff at both trusts would recognise the processes, the escalation routes, the reporting. So I might leave it there, Gillian.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. So we've kind of already started this discussion. So Derek, and then Anne, and then Martin. And then I think, did you? Right. Okay, Derek.
Thanks. It's really a question about joining things up, because it strikes me that a lot of the issues that are being raised are culture issues. Management, bullying, discrimination, are all really symptoms of culture rather than issues in themselves. And I'm conscious that at the same time as this work is going on, there's a piece of work going on around culture. And 2 questions really. One is what's the plan for that culture work to come back to us? And the second thing is are there any ways in which we can triangulate what's going on with FTSU with the culture work?
Shall I take all the questions, Stephen?
Yeah, sure.
Is that all right? Anne?
Thank you. So it's not necessarily easy to see when you look at the background of staff raising concerns as to whether or not that's proportionate, but it did look to me as if the estates and ancillary were disproportionately high. So I wondered if there was any specific work going on in relation to that. And a question I asked at George's yesterday, do we also look at areas that don't have any concerns raised at all? because that of itself ought to be a concern, shouldn't it?
Thank you, Anne. Martin?
Yeah, one of the issues it flags up is the allegation that some staff are being asked to use their personal mobiles, and that's quite a concrete one. I mean, two things really. You think it doesn't sound like that's something that should be happening, but also, if it is true, then isn't that a risk in terms of data security, data privacy, etc.? Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Any more questions? I'm just conscious of time, so it's easier to sweep them up. Thank you, colleagues. Stephen?
So on Derek's point about culture, I mean, I may defer to Paul in terms of updating on when the plan and the details of how that culture work will come through the People Committee and onwards to the board. What I would say is that we there is quite a triangulation of issues coming up through Freedom to Speak Up that is relevant to culture. You know, the positive thing at both trusts and here at Epsom and St Helier, there is a good dialogue between the concerns coming up through Freedom to Speak Up and feeding that into the culture work. It links up both informally through the HR department, but also through the Culture, Equity and Inclusion Board. So I think we do get some of that triangulation. I think there's probably a bit more that we can do, and we're currently looking at whether we can establish a sort of management level triangulation group to bring together, you know, the themes rather than specific cases coming up through Freedom to Speak Up, HR data, patient safety data such as DATIX reports, etc., and look at where we can spot emerging hotspots, etc. And that's one of the things we're looking at the moment. So I may pause on that and hand over to Paul on the culture piece.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So you're completely right. It totally feeds into the culture works. Where we are with that, we've had our diagnostic, which has come through. We've started to share that. We're doing that at a obviously with an ESTH level, but we're working as a group on that piece of work. There's been some initial meetings where we're now into what we're calling our design phase, where we're trying to work through what are we going to do as a result of that. We're also working as we're going to be making sure that we also include a work around staff survey. It's really important that we don't have Freedom to Speak Up, culture, staff survey. It's all got to be joined up, and so we're doing that. So the intention is that we're working on it now. We will bring the plan to People Committee, and I don't have a definite time for that at the moment, but it should be fairly imminent around us doing that.
Thank you, Paul. I think that I'll hand it back to you now, Stephen.
So Anna asked about estates and the numbers there, and I think, yeah, we know that estates has been an area where we've seen a cluster of concerns come up over the course of the past year, and a lot of work has gone in, led by James and team to look and now Andrew, to look into what the issues driving that are. Andrew may want to update on that. I think to Derek's point again about triangulation, you know, one of the things the People Committee has highlighted on a number of times is the high level of vacancy rates within estates, and so I think we can look across and triangulate, you know, from the other data that we've got, not just the concerns that come up through Freedom to Speak Up. But I might turn to Andrew.
And the unhappiness about pay.
That's it. We've spent a lot of time with the team getting to understand. I think it's been a frustration at a perceived lack of communication or progress on issues, which relate back to predominantly the TUPing, which has led to pay issues. So, I think there's been a thing in the team that actually they went here because they felt it was a last resort, because they weren't being listened to by my management team, to be blunt about it. So I'm fixing that, and we are making progress now in clearing this backlog of issues that we have. So I think the root causes of these are very well understood. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. Very helpful. Right.
And then the final point that Martin raised about personal mobiles. I mean that's
no, there was another point. Anne's point about areas of.
Oh, sorry. Yes, you're quite. Apologies, Anne. Absolutely. Yeah. So actually, in terms of cold spots, you know, you referenced the question at the Georges board yesterday, and the answer is very similar in that, yes, we do look at the areas where we're not getting concerns as well as those areas where we are. Actually, the areas where we're not are quite similar. So things like portering, for example, is an area where we typically have had fewer concerns than other areas, but also fewer concerns that you might expect. And so we do look at that and try and have conversations. And I know there are discussions where the Guardian service has engaged with staff to try and understand what the reasons are, what the barriers are, and that's regarded as good practice. And then in terms of Martin's question about personal mobiles, I mean, that has come through in a number of concerns. Those themes have been fed back to the IT department, back through to Peter Davis's team. I don't know whether Andrew, in his role as CSIRO, would want to comment from a data security perspective.
Andrew, do you want to? Could you?
It's a big and complicated issue. And one of the things I think we probably need to look at it more in a more structured way, to step back from it in terms of the individual issues and say, actually, the fundamental issue is who needs to be able to communicate. Because just because you want a phone doesn't necessarily mean you need one. But then where you need a phone, we need to make sure you have one. There are increasing issues and I think awareness around, as you say, data security. And we've had, well, there is always the risk of inappropriate use and sharing of information through different routes, and storing information on personal devices is always going to be a challenge. So I think we need to take it away and have a look. Yeah. But I think the key issue is need, I think, in terms of that we need to get into, because some of the use your own phone may actually relate to relatively simple amounts of communication that's needed. Whereas where there's real need for communication and contact, we do need to ensure. And I am very confident, certainly for St George's and pretty confident for Epsom, if someone needs a phone for their role, we will provide them a phone.
I think it would be helpful. I think it's a good point that Martin raised. I do think it needs taking away. It's a vast subject. And I think there will be hard issues about people who feel they need a phone, but actually they want a phone. But
so
Martin, you wanted to come back?
Completely agree with that. But I was also looking at it from another angle. I mean, one of the things that helps a lot to encourage people to use the service is if they see results. And I wonder if there was, and it's not my place to say perhaps, but it just struck me there might be a quick win if at some point comms could clarify, no, our policy is that no, people are not expected to use their personal phone for NHS Trust business.
I understand where you're coming from, Martin. I suspect that is fraught without understanding the subject more than we do, because I suspect loads of people use their phones at the moment to the benefit of the service, really. Okay. And I know nurses on wards have WhatsApp groups in order to. So I'd rather that we took it. I mean, I think you're absolutely right to flag it up. But I'd rather we took it away and had a proper look at it, because I suspect it's big and complicated. And could result in a lot of additional costs that we can't afford.
Can I suggest we push that as an action down to the Finance Committee, where it looks after IT issues, so we can pick that rather than leave it as an action for the board?
Yeah, no, I think certainly it shouldn't be left with the board. We need a committee to look at it. But I think Martin's raised a really important point. But I do think it's complicated. Derek?
I'm just wondering if it needs to go further than the Finance Committee, because it's right, so there's two issues. Using your own device, which you pay for, and I think that's just, as a clinician, just to triangulate, I mean, that's just what we do all the time. And we're expected to dictate on our mobile phones, and we're expected to put apps on our mobile phones that enable clinical work. And I think that's just become an expectation, and then the concept that we wouldn't use our personal devices for NHS work is that comes as a shock to me, not the other way around. I'm not shocked that I'm expected to use it. I'm just shocked that anyone would think I wouldn't use it. But then I think the security aspect, and I mean, at one stage, my experience in a different trust is that there's been a great deal of variability over what software we're expected to use and what software we're not expected to use. And is WhatsApp in? Is WhatsApp out? It is encrypted. Panopto was in at one stage. Now Panopto's out. And NHS Net was required at one stage. Now NHS Net is all being off-boarded. And I think the security aspect and the changing software aspect is something that needs to be addressed somewhere.
I think you've just illustrated the complexity very neatly, Derek, if I may say so. I do think it is for Finance Committee, though, because they're responsible for finance and IT. So I think we can safely leave it there, but the board will want to be kept briefed on this. So are people happy to leave it there? I think you've gone through your list, but James still wanted to come in on something? And then I'd like to close this report down.
So two things. First of all, just wanted to echo Steve's thanks and noting the contribution of the two Deputy Guardians over the last few weeks. I think they've been incredibly supportive and have, I've had interactions with them on a number of issues which have been really positive, as I had been having with Moira prior to her absence. I think that just on the complex issues, so I have been involved in dealing with a number of them. They're never one thing. There's normally an employee relations aspect. Quite often there's a pay aspect, a line management aspect. Sometimes there's training, education, the sustainability of the service, recruitment and retention. And so when we're thinking about dealing with them, they don't just inform our HR processes or how we narrowly respond to a concern raised through FTSU. They're also driving how we look at issues coming up through business planning. They're looking at how we drive the decisions we make about bringing together corporate services, getting clinical services to work together in a different way, because actually this is the voice of the service. This is the stuff that we don't get through other routes. This tells us things that we wouldn't otherwise know. And so I think what's really important is that when we're hearing these complex concerns, we are using that information to drive our decision making as an organisation. That's increasingly what I'm looking to do. It is in the nature of them that resolving them is sometimes not a case of dealing with a set of discrete issues and then writing back to the staff to say that they're dealt with. You can go back to the staff the first time and say we've managed to do this bit and this bit is ongoing and these are the things that we're looking at. But I think we should expect that we will continue to hear from staff in some of these areas through FTSU over an extended period of time, because these are issues that are not sort of episodic and get resolved. They will continue, and there will be, I think, a long-term process of engagement with staff where FTSU is one of the channels that's used in order to get them to the right place. Thanks.
Thank you, James. I think that's absolutely the case. I think the Trust Board is asked to do a number of things, which I'm not going to read out. I'd like the Board to support those, to note that additional piece of work that we've commissioned around mobile phones, which I think is really important, and to formally thank the two deputies. And I think we wish Moira well and hope to see her back with us soon. People happy to support all of that? Thank you very much indeed. So that takes us on to item 4.1 in the finance report. I'm hoping, Andrew, that this will be quick given the discussions we've already had.
Yeah, we are where we said we'd be at this point, if I just say that. So that's good news, bad news position, as we said before. The good news is we are where we said we'd be, so our forecasting has been robust. The bad news is, we are on course for the 35 million deficit. Against the break-even plan that we set ourselves at the beginning of the year. We have always flagged that we would not be able to achieve that, or we didn't see a route to that, and that has come to fruition. We have improved the position as we've gone through the year. The other point I think is just worth noting at this point, as at month 10, our forecast has been formally now adjusted through the national reporting process to a 35 million deficit. As we've said before, we have been very forthright with South West London and the London team, and we know that has been fed through to the national team prior to that, so they were aware we were heading for that deficit, so it is not a surprise. But our forecast has formally moved from a break-even position to a 35 million deficit as at month 10.
Thank you, Andrew, and I think that is the important point. But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that that we've kept a forecast, and that is a not insignificant achievement. So people happy to note this report? Lovely, thank you very much. So that takes us on to the closing administration. And as you see, we've already got our patient story people arrived a few minutes early. So we have no any other business. Martin has very kindly agreed to lead the reflections piece. And so over to you, Martin.
Okay, so I think the
I'm so sorry I handed over to you at a bad moment, didn't I?
Sorry?
I'm sorry I handed over to you at a bad moment.
I was starving, so I just had a quick bite. For me, I think the meeting concentrated on the right things. I think the visits and the discussion about some very specific issues that picked up was very helpful. Always difficult to get the balance right between going too far into those, which isn't appropriate in detail, but on the other hand, looking at some tangible issues. And I think apart from that, what stood out to me was the phenomenal achievements that the executive have made, with lots of improvement areas still being delivered in spite of both a hugely challenging financial environment and lots of things that are outside our control, including obviously the industrial action. So I felt that the committee was effective, looked at the right things, and I think the balance was good.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. Anyone else got any comments they'd like to offer? I thought I might pick on you, Andrew, which I know is desperately unfair, but life often is, isn't it? You're quite new to the board, so how do you feel it goes? Anything that you like or don't like about it?
Oh, so, no, I don't think there's anything I don't like. I think, what's this? I think is this the third kind of board meeting that I've got to, and actually, as I've come to know Epsom St Helier over the last 5 weeks, it feels a good reflection of the things that I have learnt and seen, and I probably thought that was the most effective board meeting we've had, actually, of the ones that I've seen. So I'm very pleased.
Thank you, Andrew. Any other points that people wanted to raise? People feel, I think Martin made it clear he feels we've covered the right material. I mean, it certainly felt that way to me, but since I've got a degree of control over it, that if I didn't think that, it would be my own fault. So I'm conscious that we've got colleagues waiting and they're busy, so I don't want to detain us any longer on reflections. I'm going to move now on to the staff patient story. I'd be really grateful if you could introduce, come and join us, as it were, with the microphone. And could you introduce, because I'm very deaf, so if you don't use the microphone, I won't be able to necessarily hear. And could you introduce yourselves, because I'm so sorry, I haven't been given your names. My apologies for that.
My name's Safia Ahmed. I'm one of the ED registrars at St Heliers Hospital.
Welcome.
Thank you. So basically, I'm here to talk about a patient story that's helped us improve our care within the ED department. So a little bit background on the patient story. So the patient attended ED following epistaxis, so that's nosebleed, after having been started on a medication to help reduce blood clots. So during the triage, the patient mentioned to the nursing staff that they had a peanut allergy and they carried an EpiPen. The doctor that they went on to see, they felt that the nosebleed wasn't that severe, the bleeding had stopped, so decided to discharge them with a cream called Naseptin. So this is a cream that's normally used that has antibacterial properties to try and prevent infection. So the patient then re-emphasized that they suffered with a nut allergy and asked if the medication contained peanut oil. So the doctor then informed them that they would check. It's unclear at that point as to what resources were used to check that, but they got back to the patient informing them that they didn't think the Naseptin contained nut oil. The patient has then gone home and read up the advisory leaflet that comes with the medication, and there they discovered that the Naseptin cream in fact did contain Arachis oil. Arachis oil is peanut oil. Sorry. So then the patient has then contacted the ED department. It's unclear at that point who they spoke to, whether or not it was administration staff or clinical staff, and they asked for an alternative medication. The EDT, whoever they spoke to, informed them that there was no alternative. They have then contacted their own GP for an alternative medication. The patient has then put in a complaint because they wanted to highlight this so that this didn't affect other patients. So what actions were taken going forward? So from us as a department, we have a complaints team. They have reviewed the complaints and they have brought about what lessons we can learn and then what actions needed to be taken to implement what actions needed to be going forward. So in terms of actions that were taken, a safety alert was formalised. So a safety alert is usually a bulletin, and that highlighted to us that we should be checking medications against not only drug allergies, but food allergies as well. In terms of the clinician involved, the clinician was spoken to, and they reflected upon this, and this was included as part of their appraisal. And it was emphasised to them that it is their responsibility for checking medications against drug allergies. The safety alert was also highlighted within our newsletter and within the clinical governance meeting as well. So overall, for us as a department, this has really sort of impacted on us in terms of how we improve our practice. So not only about asking about drug allergies, but also about food allergies as well. And in future, obviously, so if there is a food allergy, we should really be checking resources such as the MHRA guideline. Sorry, I think my nerves have got the better of me.
You're doing brilliantly. Thank you so much.
Okay. So I think overall, I think it's really reflected upon ourselves as a department that we should really be sort of changing the way we practice. So not only checking upon drug allergies, but also re-emphasise to us about food allergies as well. So I think it's really sort of helped us with it as a department.
Thank you so much. We've probably got some questions, if that's okay, is it? Do you mind?
No,
and I don't know whether your colleague...
I've got my consultant who's in the...
Yes. Hello, thank you so much for coming to join us. So, James.
Thanks so much.
Do you want to draw 2 seats? I don't like you standing like that. Pull 2 seats forward. You'll make me feel so much more comfortable.
Oh, no.
Okay, thank you. That's better. Now we're all sitting down. I felt I had to stand up. Right, James.
So I'm James, I'm the Managing Director, and thanks so much for coming to talk to us about this. I mean, I've spent a fair bit of time down in ED and I see how very, very busy it is, and how with anything like this you need to be able to access the information really promptly to enable you to do the right thing, but do it quickly because it's very pressured on time. So my question is, do you think there's anything as a trust we can do in terms of some of the information systems that you have in ED that would help you to identify these food allergies? Because I know that we've got systems around identifying potential adverse drug reactions and drug intolerances, but I suppose I'm guessing that they haven't automatically stretched to include food intolerances. So, is there anything we could do to help?
So I think in terms of our guidelines, when we have our triage paperwork, instead of just highlighting it as drug allergies, we could probably move to incorporating food and drug allergies, so it's there on the triage. Also, I think as a department, we're also looking into electronic prescribing, so I think that will be quite useful for us. So there it automatically pops up as, this is a food allergy.
Obviously when we get Cerner next year, so that will be part of it, and when we prescribe it, we'll it can show up now, but what we currently use is paper prescriptions. So what we can possibly do is, where it says allergies on there, on the paper prescription, change it to include also check for food allergies besides just medication allergies.
Thank you. Martin, I think I saw your hand, and then Ruth.
Yeah, just to declare an interest, both my wife and my children have got some severe food allergies, and had, I think, 3 ambulance trips with anaphylactic shock to A&E over the years. I was just a bit surprised, but I think you just answered it because you talk about paper prescriptions. I always assumed, and I guess it would be in a GP environment, it would be, I assume that I always assumed that as they do a prescription, it would come up an alert that, at least for common allergies, and clearly nuts are a common one, that it would come up an alert. I was just a bit surprised that not so much the ED environment, but just that it can happen at all.
So because we still have our, at least from the ED, our prescribed, it doesn't come, we really need to check. We do check our CAS card that is there to see, and we always ask the patient that if they have any allergies. And that was part of our education that we did after this incident, to make sure that everyone knows that they need to check for food allergies besides just checking for medication allergies. So like I mentioned, when we get Cerner next year, it's when we prescribe on Cerner, it will come up as a pop-up to check for food allergies that this contains peanut oil, specifically to Herceptin.
Thank you. I'm glad that there's something coming that will make it a whole lot easier. Ruth.
Thank you, and I thank you for your candour and for sharing the sort of experience and learning. You know, when I sit across the way in children's outpatients, I'm protected in some respects because most areas in the trust now do prescriptions electronically. And as Martin says, you know, in my career here, I've had several alerts come up saying, do you know, this contains cow's milk protein, et cetera, and it's allowed me to change prescription. I think what your presentation highlights are 2 system issues that we need to help you with. The first is that you don't yet have electronic prescribing in ED, and that's in contrast to almost every other area in the trust, I think, just for background information. So you are an outlier in that respect. And then I think there is a second issue which we need to take away as well, and that relates to how your medication is dispensed. So ED is 24/7, and you are doing things very quickly. So you are getting medication from your cupboards in ED, as opposed to sending a patient to pharmacy where there's an extra checking mechanism in place. So I think in looking for solutions, we need to look at the 2 things. I don't personally think we wait until Cerner comes along. I know you've done a lot of learning yourselves, but I think Arlene and I need to take away this case and look at what more we can do to address the system issues that you've so eloquently highlighted.
Thank you for that. So previous to COVID, we did send at least outpatients to the pharmacy, and it's been some time, and we've highlighted this to the pharmacy department that we want to reinstitute that we send patients to pharmacy at least in hours, and they get the prescriptions done that way. But we've unfortunately had some resistance from them that we don't put that back on. Coming to your first point, yes, it would be a very good thing if we do go to electronic prescribing as soon as possible. So.
I think that's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much, Ruth, for what you've said. I think it's really interesting that you guys took all this on yourself, did all that learning, did what you could, but by bringing it here, we've illustrated that actually, as a trust, we can do more to help. Were there any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Paul and then Derek.
Excuse me. No, it's fine. Situation like this, it's an opportunity to learn, but clearly you have. How, reflecting back on how you dealt with it, is there any learning for how you can deal with these situations so they don't just become something that you blame people, but you learn from? Would you do anything differently, or would you advise differently if you were looking at it again?
I think we have a very robust complaints and feedback mechanism in the department, wherein anything, small thing doesn't have to be, wherein in this case, the patient didn't come to harm. And even if the patient has not come to harm, we take that very seriously. And that's fed back to the individual who was involved or the individuals. As part of our whole, we have a monthly M&M morbidity and mortality meetings. We have our ED newsletter. We have clinical communication safety alerts. So there are multiple different avenues that we use so that the patient, all the staff do remember such things. Something that we would do different. Nothing currently that clearly comes to my mind because obviously I'm a new consultant, but I've been here as a trainee and a registrar, so I know that the department puts a lot of importance behind all of these learnings and everything. So we can certainly look into ways we can improve. And that's something that I can carry back to my team to see where we can improve that process.
Thank you, Derek.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that story, and I think the learning before the harm, or learning where there might have been harm but there wasn't harm, and spotting those scenarios is really important, really valuable. But I'm conscious that Naceptin is an antimicrobial, and wonder what guidance and help do you get in terms of when to prescribe an antimicrobial and when not to prescribe an antimicrobial? Because of course we're really worried about antimicrobial resistance across the trust and the world. Do you get guidance and help about when to use a medication like that, regardless of the allergy aspect?
So we do have guidance from our microbiology team who give us on what antibiotics to use, and it's a shared decision with the. If there's a very obvious need, then patients showing signs of infection and stuff, then we obviously have to use it. Naceptin specifically is part of a guidance that's used across, at least wherever I've worked in, across South London, as part of patients who present with epistaxis and nosebleed. If we have any specific question wherein we are not sure whether we should use it or not, the microbiology team is always available, and we can just give them a ring and ask for their advice. Yeah.
And just to add that we, on our safety alert, we did highlight the MHRA regulatory body guideline, which does say what medications can be used when and where, and to use if the benefit outweighs the risk. So we have put in processes to refer to that guideline as well.
I can't see any other hands, so I just wanted to thank you again, both for coming, but for being prepared to share this story and demonstrate the very rigorous approach you've got to learning. I think we're all really impressed with that. And I hope that you've heard some response from Ruth that might actually help avoid these kind of situations in the future, over and above your own learning and your own commitment to that, which I have to say is really impressive. So thank you so much. It's lovely to meet you both, even around the board table, and keep up the great work, because I think, you know, we're very conscious that you've done all this learning and thought about this while you've got this incredibly busy day job. So the fact that you've made time to do that is kind of doubly impressive. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. So that brings the meeting formally to an end. I think we all know that we end the meeting and then we deal with questions. So we do have a question, quite a long question, which I think, James, you're going to deal with.
Yes. So thank you. I will give some summary information. I don't know if colleagues may want to come in on some elements of it, because there are 8 parts. So I'm planning.
James, I think we're very happy. It's material we're familiar with. I think if you indicate what the question is and the generality of it, that would be sufficient.
So Mr. Lahendran from Merton Seniors Forum has asked a number of questions. The first is about emergency care performance, and I've referred him back to the IQPR, which we considered earlier. The second was the trust current workforce capacity, which I've supplied. The second is our percentage of agency staff, and I've talked about the 5 to 6% of the trust pay bill that is typically agency from month to month. The fourth related again to A&E waiting times. The fifth was about the place assessment, and I've indicated that we are still looking at a number of areas that were identified through the place assessment. The sixth was around whether we had a virtual ward, and I've confirmed that we do have a virtual ward and we flex capacity within the virtual ward services depending on demand. The seventh was about immediate building works, and what I've confirmed here is that we do have significant backlog maintenance challenges with a value of around £130 million, and we do prioritise the most urgent works from within our available capital. The final one was about whether it would be better to concentrate on the current building rather than trying to build a new hospital. And I've responded to this by reaffirming our commitment to the development of the Specialist Emergency Care Hospital, as well as improvements to both Epsom and St Helier, and highlighting that, as well as addressing estates challenges, the SETCH programme will also address the workforce and financial challenges that are caused by having 24/7 services twice, consolidating acute inpatient care, and that it would not be viable to simply refurbish our current buildings because they are not capable of meeting the most modern standards for acute healthcare.
Thank you very much indeed, James, for that comprehensive rattle through a lot of questions. Okay, so that's us finished for now. Thank you very much to a member of our audience who stuck with us throughout, and we're back on for our private meeting at 1:15. Thank you, colleagues.